Runkle of the Bailey. It is early. I did not get to sleep until, I don't know, let's say 5. So I'm tired. Oh, and I should probably turn my light on here. How's everyone doing? This is not a good, I would say that this would be a Scotch video, except that it is still really early. It's, 7:15. See people saying good morning. I don't know if it is. I like the sentiment. I appreciate the sentiment, but I am not feeling great, and I can tell you that I don't have high hopes for how this is going to go. Some people are saying, "Hey, do you think we're going to get some actual answers here?" I don't think we are. What we're probably going to see is some exceptional weasel wording, and somebody on Twitter, and I'm not calling this person out. I'm not saying that they were wrong or anything or whatever. We're saying I want to see some legal commentary. Otherwise I'm going to go watch Viva, because Viva's better at the sort of the angry snark. And I go, well, I don't know how much legal commentary I'm going to be able to give with a guy who doesn't answer a straight question or doesn't give a straight answer to anything. So I'm going to do my best on the legal commentary, but I am tired and I am annoyed. I see a lot of people are asking, how about that Bill C-21 thing? I have a video on that is ready to go. I will release that later this afternoon, because releasing it right now seems like bad timing. That just that seems like a little bit like, hey, I'm going to compete with myself. It's probably going to be video 1 of like 602 on this issue, because quite frankly, what they're doing is ridiculous. Basically, Trudeau has decided that there is no limit to the number of Indigenous Canadians he wants to put in jail. And so he's found a way to jail a whole lot of them. Because I can tell you that the SKS is super popular on reserves. So, yeah. And 9-inch Nails gal, thank you very much. I should be sleeping, but insomnia means some kangaroo dollars for you. I love your dry wit and Canadian snark. Love tired Runkle for Runkleisms. Well, thank you very much. Scott says good morning. It doesn't feel like morning when you only sleep like 2.5 hours. And I say sleep. I did not sleep super well. I put my head on the pillow and I didn't move for a couple hours, but I don't know how much actual sleep I got in that. So I'm really hoping that that Trudeau's up first, because once he does his thing, I'm probably headed back to bed. If people want, I am thinking that we will that I may go back to the beginning of these and just do a live or reaction commentary from the beginning. So people should let me know if that's something they'd want to see, because yeah. So Against the Tide is noting that I've still got a extra life fundraiser going on. So, pardon me. And I see somebody saying you forgot one small thing, Runkle. Indigenous are exempt. There is no proposal in here to make the Indigenous exempt. I also have an entire video on how the exemption in the previous order in council isn't really something that anyone can rely on. It's more of a trap than a gift. So, yeah. All right, so I see Lazarus Runkle. I'm from Ontario and shot my first deer yesterday and had fresh venison heart with dinner in my stand right now. So wish me luck. Congratulations, and I mean that seriously. That's a big moment. I got my first one like a few years ago, and it was fantastic. The other thing that really kind of so last year I got a couple of deer, and both of them I managed to shoot straight through the heart, which is great from one sense, because the deer just goes down at that point, right? It's just as instant as you can imagine. But I kind of wanted deer heart, so I didn't get that from either of them. So uh, sad face, but yeah, no, deer heart is fantastic. So good luck. I hope that whatever you've got tags for, deer, elk, moose, whatever it is, decides to wander out right in front of you, and then just stand giving you that perfect sideways facing for as long as it's willing, as long as you need. Ryan 432, bet Trudeau can't wait to invoke the Emergencies Act against non-compliant First Nations. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is that now that the door has been opened for invoking the Emergencies Act, we have the very real possibility that it's going to get invoked again. And, whatever protest it gets invoked against might be one you like. So even the people who are like, hey, I hate the convoy, you can hate the convoy and think that everyone involved in it is a terrible person. You can think they're all absolutely terrible people. And there were some terrible people out there. But that doesn't mean that shutting it down through this kind of thing is a good idea. So what do you figure they're going to abolish the OIC altogether because C21 covers it all? Then they don't have to do the buyback at all. I don't know if they're going to do any buyback, to be honest. At this point, they're really weaseling about that. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. You give love a bad name. Love it. Yeah. So right now we're just waiting. Oh, and I see Scott Cardinal's in the chat. That is awesome. So right now we're just waiting for this to start up. I think they're scheduled to get going in about 7 minutes, but we'll see if they actually start on time. Who knows? I suspect they're going to be ready to go right at the time. It looks like they have been on previous days. So yeah. This stream brought to you by Red Bull, not because they sponsored me, because they didn't. I get nothing from them, but because this is helping me stay awake. I was going to do a gag where I just tossed this over my shoulder. I really was tempted. And then I remembered that I've got a painting from Christina Michaels behind me, and I thought, better not. So, yeah, yeah. I see people saying need vodka with Red Bull. Listen, I'm going to be salty enough without vodka. And also, there were people on Twitter saying, hey, listen, you need to do a drinking game about this. And I'm saying, guys, I cannot do a drinking game for this. Because if I do a drinking game for this, I will probably die. And it is too early in the morning to be dead. I don't want to die until a respectable time in the afternoon. Because if I'm going to die, I'd like to at least feel well rested when I do. That probably doesn't make any sense. But somebody says, have I skimmed previous days at all? I have a little bit. And that's the thing, is I've got I've been busy. So at some point I'm going to, I'm deciding as to whether I want to go back and sort of watch it with commentary from the beginning. But because I figure that with commentary will at least make, like, doing the commentary will make me at least a little more able to sit through it. I fear it will start with a super long-winded softball parade from the Commission Council. Of course it will. That's the point of the Commission Council. It's all going to be, aren't you the best prime minister who ever lived, who, never did blackface and never mocked Indigenous water protesters? So, yeah. Nicholas Starro, welcome. Says, good afternoon and welcome to my 3-hour car ride. Ouch. I didn't know that Sweden had 3 hours of driving. That's not an insult. It's just that, it's a smaller country. So I'm just curious as to where you'd be going. But will I be in your ear the entire time? I hate to say this. I hope not, because I am so tired. And I'm hoping that Trudeau finishes up and that we can move on, and that I can get some sleep, because I also need to be up again at 4 in the afternoon to do court stuff. So I'm hoping to get some nap in between there. Devin Cutmore is asking, hello, do you practice law in Ontario? I can for a limited number of days per year, but as a general rule, if you have an issue in Ontario, you should probably hire somebody in Ontario, because things get really expensive when you start flying back and forth. So I can possibly, depending on the issue, I can possibly recommend somebody in Ontario. The other thing is, a lot of the people who inquire about, hey, do you practice law, end up going, I have a civil issue and I don't do civil cases. So maybe I'll branch out if I ever actually manage to sort of pull off the dream. The dream is I make YouTube the primary income, and then I go and just run a pro bono law firm entirely. Um, if I can pull that off, then I also want to branch out into some landlord tenant stuff. Um, because once if I can do some landlord tenant stuff, it's one of the areas where there's a lot of people who need help and have no money. So that would be something I'd want to do if I could, but we will see. All right. 9 Inch Nails Gal, thank you very much. If I'm gonna die, I'd like to do it well rested. Needs to become merch. Um, I have had nothing but difficulty with the whole merch thing. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure. I might end up just at some point just my merch might end up being that every once in a while I make something out of leather and sell it. Which is a very effortful kind of merch. It would basically be a hobby thing, but it also means that if you have a Runkle item, that it's sort of something unique. I really don't like the quality of most of the merch options out there. And yeah. Caffeine Junkie is saying, are you opening another Red Bull? Runkle, you might end up with palpitations and high blood pressure. I feel like I'm going to end up with high blood pressure regardless. Also, when I'm getting, somebody named Caffeine Junkie is saying, hey, Runkle, I'm concerned about your caffeine use, I might have a problem. But there is no 12 step for, like, do you drink too much cola? So I'll just live with it. That's, hey, Runkle, good morning. Could you do a quick recap of what's been said? I don't have the right sound on my soundboard, but if I did, it would be sort of like a duck quacking noise. I feel like that would be the right sound. So, yeah, a quick recap is tough. All right. So, question: I really want to help protect and uphold freedom and liberty in Canada. I'm in high school right now. How can I make the biggest difference? Runkle, notice me, senpai. You're noticed. And I mean, right now, I think that I don't really endorse parties. I don't like politicians as a general rule. The reason why is because I kind of feel like the person who thinks that a politician is their friend is sort of akin to the same person who thinks that the stripper loves them. And they don't. They're not. You're just about to lose your money. But right now, I would say volunteer for a political campaign that is not the Liberal Party of Canada. So I guess I will. Yeah, I see Sweden, a small country relative to Canada or the U.S. Yeah. Bring in the puppies. The puppies are smarter than I am. And I say that because the puppies right now are asleep. In fact, when I tried to wake up, or when I was waking up for this, the puppies jumped up and or at least one of them, Zora specifically. Potter, he's just like, I got business. I'm sleeping, and that's all we're doing right now. Zora jumped up and sat on me and was like, "Don't go, just snuggles." I'm going, yeah. So, and I see, what is it? Weaver1138. Thank you for the super chat here. Liberal supporter here, but can't stand the government's firearm policy, not based in evidence. Always love the coverage, Runkle. Thanks. I've been hearing from a lot of people who are saying I've been a liberal supporter.
Order alert.
Oh, and we've got action alert here. All right, there we go. We've also got video. But
the Public Order and Emergency Commission is now in session. La commission sur l'état d'urgence est maintenant ouverte.
Okay, good morning, bonjour. So we're at the last day of the public hearings on the facts. There will be, of course, the public hearings on policy matters. Alors, c'est la dernière journée.
So this is our last day to receive testimonies on facts,
lucky shot,
relevant facts,
probably not luck,
and of course
well
there will be the certain policies next week.
Commission counsel.
Shantona Chaudhry for the commission. Our next and final witness is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
All right, why is this? I'm guessing it's because it's minimized that it's not updating.
Well,
all right, so they're starting with Justin Trudeau, which is a mercy to me because then I get to get some coverage here. I am not in Florida.
Maybe we'll
going to
take
Viva's
a few
coverage.
minutes.
Fair enough.
I'm not sure what process is, a bit anticlimactic.
I do have some thoughts on that.
so-
Basically, the
Should we take
government
5
is
minutes?
saying that these.
I think we'll take 5 minutes then. and
If
see, and
CSIS
you
had
can
all
come
the
and get
power
me
that
when
they
it,
want
it
to
is.
have, then it
Thank
would
you.
have been
La
fine.
commission is in
Oh,
recess
no,
for
okay.
5 minutes. La commission en avait pour 5 minutes.
Go ahead. It's just a bit of a false start. So, nothing to do with your appearance. You're welcome to come in. Obviously, we're happy to get started.
All right.
Can the witness be sworn or affirmed?
Mr. Prime Minister, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
J'aimerais le faire sur la Bible, s'il vous plaît.
So he's
like
choosing
to
to
swear
swear
on
on
the
the
Bible,
Bible. I bet he does a lot of this in French, specifically to make it harder to quote him in the rest of Canada.
S'il vous plaît, veuillez indiquer et ensuite épeler votre nom en entier.
Please say your name.
Oui, j'affirme. Et Justin Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau.
Will everything be a few sentences in English? Repeated in French?
JUSTINTRUDEAU.
Yes. There's going to be lots of French.
Will you speak the truth and nothing but the truth? I swear. Thank you.
Yeah, he often likes to say his controversial stuff in French.
Before we get started, there, as I understand it, as you heard, there will probably be some testimony in English and some in French. So please, if you need translation equipment, you should have it at hand.
But we will have translation on the stream here, so that
Morning,
we
Prime Minister.
should be good to go.
Morning.
Thank you for being here. So we'll start with the routine housekeeping. You recall being interviewed by Commission Counsel on September 9th of this year.
Yes.
Okay. And after that interview, Commission Counsel prepared a summary of your interview.
Yes.
For the record, we don't need to call it up, Mr. Clerk, but it's WTS.5084. And Prime Minister, you reviewed that summary and you can confirm that it's accurate to the best of your knowledge.
Yes.
Okay, and I'll add there that, of course, it's a summary. It's not an exact transcript of your words, but it's a prepared summary, and we're all aware of that. So, Prime Minister, as you know, you are the final witness to testify before the Commission. So at this point, the Commission has heard a lot of evidence about the events of January and February leading up to your government's decision to declare a public order emergency on February 14th. But what we haven't heard yet is your perspective. So your own perspective, your viewpoint, both as the Prime Minister leading the country through these events
whoever said,
and the
"Are we
decision
gonna start
maker
this off
and
with
the
some
government's
puff
ultimate decision
pieces and
to invoke
soft
the Emergencies
questions?"
Act for the
You
first
bet.
time in that act's
Here
history.
we go.
So we have 2 hours together this morning,
This
and
is
I
why
anticipate that the
I and Viva
examination
not
is going
streaming this
to
together.
proceed in 2
I
parts. The
actually
first
should have
part
reached
will
out to
consist
him.
of
I
fairly
didn't-
specific questions
didn't
taking
think.
you through the chronology
but
of
we're doing it
events,
separately.
often with reference to documents that have been adduced before the Commission, readouts of your own calls. And the second
That's
part
fair
will
about the
consist
narrow
of
and
some
long.
bigger picture questions.
Don't
So
do the
addressing
26-hour
some of
car
the
ride.
key themes that have arisen out of these events and the government's response to it.
So,
So
this is
let's
so
start
not cool
with
with your
the
French comment.
chronology
Canada's
of
two
events.
official
And
languages. Yes, I am
I'll
French
warn you,
speaking
we're going to
Canadian.
fly through
They
this
are,
pretty
but
quickly.
the way he
2 hours is not a lot of
does a
time to fly
language
through
switch
everything that happened
in order
between
to
these
avoid
days. But
certain issues.
if ever you feel like you
is
need to add
something
in
that
some
annoys me.
narrative or explanation, please feel free to do so.
You know, it's not that
So
French
we'll
is
start
bad.
with
It's
just the
that trying
pre-arrival
to
days. So
avoid
before the convoy
being
arrived in
potable,
Ottawa, we know that
is
you
the
learned the
issue
convoy
there.
was on its way a few days before, maybe around January 24th.
All right,
You were briefed on
people
it
in the
by
chat, if
both
you want to
officials
make
from PCO and your own
you know,
staff from PMO. Can
violent
you recall
comments,
what
you
your
will get banned
expectation
from
was
the
at that
chat.
point?
That's just
So
not happening.
you've been briefed, the convoy is on its way. What did you anticipate was going to happen?
Mais on avait vu pendant les mois qui ont précédé.
So in the preceding months, we had seen a certain level of frustration mounting with regard to the vaccine mandate. And we had heard some strong language emanating from several people across the country. This also
And I had to mess with my mic. Can
reflected
people
what
hear
we
me?
had seen during the
Just give me
election
a thumbs up
campaign
in
6
chat
months
if you can hear
prior.
me.
So when we saw that those groups were coming down to Ottawa, we were expecting to some activity and strong language around that, things that we had already seen.
Oh, no, strong
However,
language.
we regularly see demonstrations across the country. We pay attention to those, and we try to be prepared for those events. Question. You spoke about the electoral campaign. Could you elaborate on that, please? The electoral campaign was a time when Canadians could be health. More specifically, the vaccine mandate for people who wanted to use public transit,
But people are still
or people who
entitled
wanted to work for the federal public service. That was a major decision to limit access to public transportation. And so it was very important that Canadians could speak their mind with regard to this. We want to keep people healthy and safe, and I thought it was totally appropriate
it shouldn't be using my
to
webcam
have
mic.
healthy and strong debates on those issues. And that's exactly what happened during the elections. Several parties were for what we were saying, others were strongly against. And Canadians during this campaign could speak their minds. What we also saw, my team and myself, we saw a certain level of frustration, of demonstration,
Okay, is this
and
better
of-
on the sound quality?
a certain level of aggressiveness, let's say a certain intensity of emotions with regard to that campaign, with regard to
Intensity
what
of
we were
emotions. Okay, that needs the Emergencies
proposing.
Act.
And that exceeded what we had seen in prior political events or such campaigns. So there, we could see that there was potentially a strong intensity.
This is absolutely rehearsed. Yeah,
We saw
sorry.
that
For some
in the
reason, it
few months
switched to my
prior,
webcam mic.
And we were suspecting this could reach up to Ottawa with that convoy.
Just to sum that up, and I'll switch back to English. I think we'll probably be switching back and forth a few times. You saw the protest coming and you've been briefed on it. And as you said, Ottawa is used to dealing with big protests, but there was maybe a hint that something could be a little bit different here. So there was a hint of worry there. And then, of course, we know that the convoy started arriving on the 28th.
Yeah, I like French. I just don't
went
like
into full
using
swing
a
on the
language
29th.
switch to
What was that
dodge
first
criticism.
weekend like when the convoy arrived from your point of view?
Well, first of all, one of the things that
Oh,
we
I may have
noted
to reach
in
out to
the
him now.
run-up to the arrival was a bit of a disconnect between what the sort of political arms of my office were seeing and expecting from what we'd seen on social media, colored by our experiences from the campaign that was only a few months before, contrasted with the assurances by whether it was Ottawa Police Services or even the public service, that this was just a normal, quote unquote, style of protest that we see on the Hill fairly regularly. And there was already a little bit of worry that this might be a different brand of
The thing is that
of
effective protests
event
are
than
disruptive
Canadians
protests.
were used to seeing. And
Stonewall
we
was
certainly
a
saw
riot.
during the first
The U.S.
weekend
civil rights movement
that
was
the
disruptive as
expectations
hell.
that the police had said
But-
that they would simply go home,
Yeah.
the ability to keep it under control was not exactly there.
Okay, and I think starting on that Sunday, you made a few calls to various MPs in your Ottawa caucus, sort of checking in and seeing how people were doing, because there was a level of concern there. So on that note, I'll ask Mr. Clerk to please pull up ssm.can.nsc402813.
Next time, they probably will invoke
While
the
that's being
Emergencies
pulled up,
Act for that.
it's a readout of a call that you had on Sunday, January 30th.
Oh, I got to
with
reach out to
Yasser
Spidey
Naqvi.
then.
Just for the benefit of everyone in the room, can you tell us who Yasser Naqvi is?
Yasser is the Member of Parliament for Ontario, for Ottawa Centre.
Okay, perfect. So if we can just scroll down to the text here, Mr. There we go. So, hey, Yasser, how are you, PM? How are you doing? And how are folks in the community? And Mr. Naqvi says, very dire. Community feels under siege. You can imagine number of trucks, rigs, honking.
So this
For them,
is
it's a party, but they
their
forget it's
lawyer
also
is
the
going to
neighborhood, especially low-income
puff up
families.
the.
I've been getting a lot of
I mean, and
feedback.
that's just
Also
what
been
their
in touch
lawyer's
with
going to do.
Marco, that's Minister Menachino, Bill, I assume Minister Blair, and local officials, finding ways to make sure these folks are not part of residential streets. Tonight will be challenging. And you say, I feel so gutted for so many people who are just in such a difficult situation. It's not just disruption, but there's a lot of hateful rhetoric going on. Are you seeing some
And
of that?
People are allowed to
And
engage in
Mr.
rhetoric,
Naqvi says it's
including rhetoric
unbelievable.
that is
The images that we see are hard to
obnoxious.
believe. Saw a life-size
Up
poster on a
until
truck
a
of
very
Hitler and
high
the name
limit.
underneath. This is the kind of grossness our country is subject to. I have constituents being yelled at for wearing masks while out doing normal chores. There are all kinds of issues people are facing in the neighborhood. I don't know if they can sleep at night. And you then reply, there doesn't seem like much clarity on how long this will last. And then you refer to an incident at the Shepherd of Good Hope. And then finally, your last comment here is, I'm so sorry, my friend, this is just horrible. the RCMP is concerned, everyone's on eggshells.
Yeah,
Having
and
this going on in our nation's
she's gonna
capital
puff up
is just
that the
totally
Emergencies Act was
irresponsible.
the right thing
So
to do.
to some extent, that's self-explanatory, but I'm wondering if you can help us a little bit in explaining the context of that call and what Mr. Knockvey was referring to and what
I've
you'd
been on
observed
Viva's
yourself.
channel, but
Well,
Viva
I
usually
dare
is
say
doing his
that
own thing.
citizens
Him and
of
Barnes.
Ottawa are used to political activity and protests.
But yeah, this would be good to
on the
do
Hill,
a
on
thing with
a
him.
range of things. But this was present and in their daily lives and disrupting their weekend in a way that wasn't a usual political protest.
But that's not-
from the intimidation and harassment of people for wearing masks to a very concerning story about folks disrupting the nearby homeless shelter and soup kitchen. There were indications that there was a level of disregard for others that unfortunately we had seen examples of during the election campaign. And it emphasized for me that this was the same kind of thing that we had seen, the intensity, the anger, the hateful rhetoric.
Okay.
Yeah. I
Moving on then,
suspect.
Mr. Clerk, to the next document, ssm.can.nsc 402812. So
And
Prime
that's
Minister, this
something
is
that they
moving
could
on to
have
the
charged
next day.
people
So
with
the-
and could have
that'd be Monday
dealt
the
with.
31st. I
Every
think at some
protest
point there was
is disruptive,
some hope or expectation
however.
that the convoy might disperse by Monday, but it didn't. And at that point, you have a call with Mayor Jim Watson of Ottawa. So we'll just look at a couple of things here. The initial reference is to a press conference you've done, and he tells you you hit it at the park, hit all the right notes, and then says these people had their time and need to move on. So he's and he's trying to get this across to the chief of police, be Chief Slowly. So Mayor Watson is obviously very focused on putting an end to the protest if he can. Scrolling down then, that last bit, JW, that's Mayor Watson. Chief of Police said it's so volatile, but kept under control so far. Trucks are starting to leave, but
And you
the
can see
diehards
the
chained themselves
key
for this,
turning
to
point is
this.
the Terry
It's
Fox
unfortunate for
statue, the
people living in the
tomb.
neighborhood. Chief
like,
of Police spoke
mess-
to Chief
like,
Lucky. and we
people
need
standing
a
on
few more
statues is
sources. I
pretty
think that probably
common
means
protest stuff.
resources, and you say that's for sure. And then it goes on. He says, a little more. We have to do this with a sense of balance. These guys are just looking for a fight. And your comment back on that, just down
Which
to
is why they were
Clerk,
joking about
is
tanks.
the remainders will have no choice but to incite as a counterbalance. So we all have to be careful. Can you explain those last few comments and the balance and counterbalance you were referring to there?
Yeah, can you scroll back up to okay, no, just keep both Jim's line and mine on the screen. There we go.
I see somebody saying, I didn't realize Trudeau was so disliked. I am not a fan.
Yeah, I mean, these
And I
calls were
don't
very much
consider him to
about
be
me
left-wing at all.
understanding what's happening from a local sense. And, there was expression in this that there were some people who were more intense in the protests than others. Some were just along to be part of something that they agreed with. Others were really shaping it and draining it. And I think, I believe, I'm not entirely sure what I was saying there. I'm not sure the transcript is exactly right either, but it's enough. This sense that we didn't want to further provoke, but we need to be firm in standing up for people. We need to encourage people to leave, but if they see that the numbers are starting to dwindle, the ones who remain will be more intense. So there's a sense already that as we manage this, we have to be careful. We want to make sure that we support and protect people living in the city. That
I hear you, Varial.
Allowing for life to get to normal despite this protest, without inciting any reactions that amplify the thing further.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. The next one, Mr. Clerk, is ssm.can.nsc 402814. So now we're at Wednesday, February 2nd, And this is a call that you have with Anita Vandenveld.
Now,
So again,
he was
can you tell
willing
us,
to
Prime
do
Minister, who
anything
Anita
except
Vandenveld
actually
is?
talk
Anita
to
is
the
a member of
protesters.
parliament for Ottawa.
Which compare and
Nepean
contrast with like guys blocking
East,
bridges who
or
he's willing to have a
I believe
discussion
that's
with.
it. Anyway, she's just to the west of downtown. She's a longtime MP and a very strong community member of parliament. And
This isn't the
she was,
campaign, dude.
she was expressing here just how the tone of and the tenor of this, what was going on in the neighborhoods and around people was worse and more hateful and different from anything she had seen before in a number of years as an MP, but a long time involved in political engagement.
So you remember this call?
Yes, I do, very much.
But I mean,
Okay, so we'll
tone
just
and,
read through a little bit of
you know,
what
of
Ms.
a
Vandenveld
protest,
said.
people are allowed to be
Um,
upset.
Starting there, you say, I wanted to check in. How are you doing? She says, I really appreciate it. I'm torn. I'm scared, but I get really mad that I'm scared.
Would you agree
Kids
with it if it was
autism,
a
the noise,
different
it's one of those
political
things, you
campaign?
feel like it's
is the
okay, well,
question.
it's awful. I'm
Like,
not a
would you
stranger
agree
to
with using
volatile
this against
environments,
Idle No
but
More
it's different because
or
I know the
the
sentiment
train
is directed
protests?
towards us, you particularly. There's this hate for liberals. And then after that, I do think it may deter some young women looking into politics. I don't want anything to happen to one of us, God forbid you, before we start thinking about all of this. And then she speaks about constituents calling about what the PM is going to do about it. It's hard, and she says it's hard because I know it's not within your purview. People are frustrated and they just want somebody to do something to get the city back.
Think about how we'd be reporting
some
on
other
this
hateful
if this had
messages that
happened in
she's,
China.
she's
Massive
observed.
protests,
You say,
you know,
it's
crack
about how you
down
balance
with
it again,
these
being
sorts of
responsible and
measures.
reasonable. So the part of this that I'd like you to
The
speak
news
to,
wouldn't
Prime
stop
Minister, is
talking about it.
where she says a lot of constituents are calling me about what the PM, what the Prime Minister is going to do about this. And she then says, it's hard because I know it's not within your purview. So what does that refer to?
That actually refers to one of the challenges and things that we were struggling with from the early days of the pandemic, of the convoy occupation, which is that because they were very visibly most motivated to protest the federal government and federal government policies, even though many of the mandates they were actually vocally concerned about were provincial measures, but it was very clear that they had targeted Ottawa and the seat of our federal government deliberately, that it was a federal protest.
Yes, I mean, that's what
in a city that
a lot of
houses the
protests
capital.
do.
There is an impression and an expectation that therefore it's it's the federal government's responsibility to deal with it, to make sure that it goes away, to stop it. There is a general expectation, even by people who are longtime residents of Ottawa, that this is somehow like Washington, D.C., that is a separate enclave where the RCMP can give out traffic tickets, which they don't. But there is a blending of orders of government in protection of Parliament Hill and the precinct that led a lot of people to say, well, they're here, they're angry at the Prime Minister, they're disrupting my neighborhood. Federal government should really do something to get rid of these protesters or move them along or have them leave.
So that's just an
Where
education problem.
We
talk
were
about
continually
division of
explaining, as
powers.
Anita said, it's not in our purview. The management of Wellington Street, of neighborhoods around, was the jurisdiction of the Ottawa Police Services. And if they needed support, the OPP and then the RCMP could be providing extra supports, but it was their jurisdiction. But of course, anyone who's involved in politics, you can be a federal MP walking through your riding and someone complains about garbage pickup. They don't want you to hear you say, oh no, that's not a federal issue, that's municipal. They say, thank you, I'll make sure we pass that message along and we'll try and see sure that gets fixed. The idea that I was
division
saying,
of powers.
this is not a federal policing issue, this is not a federal issue, this occupation, this is something that Ottawa Police jurisdiction need to take care of. For a lot of people, sort of say, well, like, see, the they're here because of the federal government, and the federal government is refusing to do anything about it, was the kind of blending of narratives that,
Well, you
that
could have,
we had to
say,
be
talk
really
to them.
careful about.
Because you
I
did
think we're
talk
going to come back to that when I
various
start
other
asking
protesters.
about Ontario's initial response to all of this, but we're not quite there yet. So I'll take you a few more things, and then I'll ask you to pick up where you left off there. So far we've been looking at some calls you've had with
Yes,
your
this
own
is the kind
MPs,
of
MPs
concern
from
I
your
have.
caucus. The next one, Mr.
I got a
Clerk,
rant
pull
that I
it up.
will
It's
save for afterwards, 'cause it'll be long.
SSM407738 is a call that you had with, excuse me, on February 3rd, Candace Bergen,
Yes, that's
who I
how this
believe
works.
had just become Leader of the Opposition in the House. I confess I was yesterday years old when I learned that, but I now know. Okay, so this is a call you then have on Wednesday, February 3rd with Ms. Bergen. And do you recall this? Do you remember this call, Prime Minister?
Yes, I do.
And can you tell us what inspired that call? Or
It was mostly a congratulatory call. When someone becomes leader of a political party that sits opposite us in the House, I tend to reach out and have a bit of a personal conversation. I usually ask after family, see how they're adjusting to it, to maybe give some recommendations about trying to get enough sleep. But I try and keep it a human
Getting enough sleep,
introductory call, even though
that's
I've
an interesting
engaged with her
notion.
many times in the House over the years as an MP. When she became leader, I wanted to reach out and establish that personal contact.
Yes, they will.
Of course, it was all happening in the context of this occupation going on. So that was part of the discussion, but primarily it was a congratulatory call.
okay, get enough sleep is always good
Yeah,
advice.
lots of redaction.
Mr. Clerk, can we scroll down a little bit? Here we see. There we go. Okay, so this is the part of the conversation that you start talking about the security situation in Ottawa. You say the second set of briefing would be security situation in Ottawa right now. Obviously of real concern, and we have lots of disagreement on causes and path forward. I would certainly like to make sure you're getting briefings on safety and the situation and have you at least fully informed. Hopefully we're all going to be able to make sure Canada's democracy continues to run and our
Here's the thing,
institutions
people
remain
do
strong,
that
and
all the
quite frankly,
time
the
because they
citizens
get their
of Ottawa
notion
get
of
back
what
to
Canadian
regular
law is
lives.
from US
Scroll down again,
TV.
please, to the next page,
But
Mr. Clerk.
I mean, a lot
So
of the
Ms.
rights they
Bergen
were
says,
asking
absolutely,
for
I
have
agree.
parallels in Canada.
I'm sure you weren't following
So
question
the
period
fact that
today,
they're
but
just,
that's what I'd
getting
like to
the
see some resolution.
the
You're right,
thing
we
that they're
disagree on
appealing to
some
wrong
things,
doesn't mean
but I
a
would
whole
agree
lot.
with you. The goal is to let's find a way for people to head back home and clear things up in Ottawa. We do want the same things. If you have some ideas or some things you think could be done, extending an olive branch is one way of putting it. We'd love to be able to work together to make that happen. All of us, and you say in reply, all of us need to focus on getting the temperature down, and getting people back to normal lives. Let's ensure there are discussions on that, and there may be opportunities to work together.
Sorry about
Some
that,
of them,
but
I think you're referring to the protesters there, have jammed themselves
lots of
into
people
a
don't speak
counter
French
in a
here, so
corner,
we'll need
and
to
their
have the
asks are
translator.
non-starters. We have our democracy and our institutions. That is well worth defending. There are ways we can get beyond this. I'm worried about setting a precedent where if anyone wants something, they can set up a blockade on Wellington Street. People need to be heard, and that's part of our democracy and getting that balance right. Ms. Bergen says she agrees with everything you said. I think that you do have to be cautious, and as PM, you don't want to set a bad precedent.
So
I'm
this
sure you're
is just
talking
them
and
trying to throw
coming up with
Bergen
some
under the
ideas,
bus
and
here
then she offers
as
to
well.
help. So the part of that I'd like you to elaborate on is, it appears there that you're talking, and I take it the olive branch is a suggestion of some engagement with the protesters, some talking to in whatever capacity that would end up being. So
And
what
hit that
comes
like
out of
button
this
if you've got a
conversation that you
chance.
have in Ms. Bergen?
It really does
with Ms.
help with the
Bergen,
channel
and what was
here.
in your mind at the time?
I say, we have.
This wouldn't surprise me at all. They do seem to be on an election
Ensure there are
platform,
discussions
or
on that. Let's ensure there are
path right
discussions on
now.
that was very much, let's make sure as political parties, we keep talking about it, keeping up,
this is
figuring out
live.
how we can work together. And then, some of their asks are non-starters, like overturning the results of the election that we just had.
Sure,
But
one idiot asked
in
for that, and
terms
then
of,
when they
responding to their demands,
realized that that was not a
or-
good thing, they
or
they
legitimizing them by
retracted it.
engaging,
Like,
I'm highlighting that I'm worried about setting a precedent. That a
Every
blockade of
protest
Wellington
has
Street
idiots at it.
can lead to changing public policy.
Idle
need to
no
be
more
heard,
called for the
but we need to get that balance
politicians
right.
to stand down.
And then she agreed that I need to be cautious and I don't want to set any bad precedents.
Okay, so fairly self-explanatory. There's a willingness to discuss, but you were concerned about setting a precedent where
Yes.
a blockade could equal
Help,
a
homeless
change in
elves.
public policy. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think we have
Yeah, if you
a
think
robust
the
functioning
convoy was
democracy,
bad,
and
I see people asking
protests,
for a
public
general
protests
strike.
are an important part
Well,
of making sure we're
general strike
getting
is way
messages
more
out there, and
disruptive.
Canadians are getting messages out there and highlighting how they feel about various issues. But using protests to demand changes to public policy is something that I think is worrisome.
Okay.
No, that's what protests do. Like,
so thank you, Mr.
seriously,
Although,
that's what
sorry, to a
protests
certain
do.
No,
extent.
please go on.
Yeah, protests, if you're out protesting that the government is, shutting down a safe injection site or something, you are asking for changes in public policy. But there is a difference between occupations and
Tell me about the U.S. civil rights
saying
movement,
we're not
Trudeau.
going until this is changed in a way that is massively disruptive. And potentially dangerous, versus just saying, yeah, we're protesting.
Did you ever read about Stonewall?
Want
Did you ever read
public
about
policy
general
to change, and we're
strikes?
trying to convince people to get enough of them that politicians will listen to enough people saying, okay, I'm going to lose votes if I don't change this. That's the usual way protests
No, the
can be
rights
effective
we
in our
have
democracies.
have been
Okay, that's a fair point
secured
of distinction. Thank you.
through, in many
Um,
cases, protests that were
Mr. Clerk,
far
the next
more
document
tumultuous.
is
and in some cases,
ssm.can.nsc 402819.
Yeah.
So, Prime Minister, we're now heading into the second weekend of the protests, so Saturday, February 3rd, and our understanding is that the protests intensified again with more trucks coming into Ottawa. And on that day, on the Saturday, you have a call with the Governor General.
Gandhi did
Simon, do you recall?
occupations by
Do you remember
his
that call?
standards.
Yes, I do.
Okay, so here is the readout of it, and we'll just go through
I
some
don't like a lot of the people at the convoy, but that, this is such a worrying,
there's the introduction.
worrying
and,
thing.
You
You
say
gotta-
it's been stressful, not so much for me personally. The Governor General says, yes, they seem reluctant to give it up also, makes it challenging. And you say, yep, people blame the feds, but many of the mandates, not us. And for the police, well, we don't direct them. Trying to get this resolved as peacefully as possible. Want them to find a way to save face, but they can't shut down our democracy. Sorry, they're trying
Protest
to
is
pull
part
you
of democracy.
into this also. They just don't understand the institutions. And then the Governor General asked to go further on that. Actually, I'll stop there. Do you remember what you're referring to in that paragraph there?
Yeah, that was I believe it was a memorandum of understanding that some groups within, or some group within the protesters had declared that what they wanted was to empower the Senate to work with the Governor
This is my
General
concern.
to create a provisional government or appoint a government committee that would change public policy, and displayed a lack of understanding of how our democracy and our institutions actually work.
Okay.
But I mean, it also meant she was getting bombarded. The Rideau Hall, which is filled with good people giving out medals to worthy
Effective
Canadians,
protests are
were
disruptive.
bombarded constantly by demands that she fire the Prime Minister, and in a very, very aggressive way. And that's what I was referring to as tough for her and tough for her team.
Understood. And is that what prompted this call?
Could have been part of it, but I also speak regularly with the Governor General just to check in, and obviously this was something that was worthwhile checking in on. But yes, that was probably the reason.
Fair enough. Okay, so then she asked if there's any sense on how it will be resolved, and you say something, and then now they're starting to do that. Bill Blair has handled a lot in the past, and we know we've heard a lot from Bill Blair at the commission as well. This is not a protest, more an occupation, hard to diffuse. It will take time, being very careful to not try to fix something we don't have the tools for. And then there's some discussion of the funding me scroll down a bit,
Protests are
Mr.
often
Clerk.
disruptive.
Onto the next page, please. And then the Governor General says, yeah, there's some of the senior staff getting a lot of hateful emails asking for the Governor General to fire the Prime Minister and to create these crazy things. It's difficult to receive these things. They made a website in my name saying stuff. I have to let it slide
Which
off my
sounds like
back,
freedom
and
of
then
expression.
Discuss the security situation. So is that where you were just referring to, Prime Minister? And
Yes.
the sort of bombardment? Okay. So just generally speaking, before we move on, what was your sense of where things were at on that second weekend?
The first weekend, caught everyone by surprise. Through the second weekend, I think I
Health
mentioned
has
it
always
in
been
referring to
provincial
Bill Blair,
jurisdiction since the beginning of the
talking with the local
Constitution.
police with his own expertise and background.
The federal government gets around that
Talk
in
about
various
things
ways.
that can be done to try to de-escalate, to start putting an end to this, understanding that it can't happen overnight, but that there are things that should be done. There was an expectation or a hope that on that second weekend, we would see a decrease in activity and a dwindling. Instead, we saw a surge on that second weekend, and things that we had heard that the police were going to start doing this or doing that, and we're going to be able to respond, didn't seem to be materializing. There was a sense that the occupation was just continuing full swing without any real control or even plan to end it. And I know from conversations with MPs and others that the citizens of Ottawa were quite frantic about having to go through a second weekend of horns and disruptions.
Is also the point of protest. I'm going to have some historical parallels later on. Once he's done yammering,
the Rideau Centre shut
it's
down,
a bit
and
of a
all these
rant.
different things that were really problematic, and people were starting to get pretty upset that this was, 2 full weekends that they were being massively disrupted by.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Clerk. Take that one down. So speaking of getting a little upset, the next topic I want to address with you is Ontario's initial response to the protest in those early weeks. So one theme that's emerged from the evidence we've heard, and we've seen this, several references to it in the documents, is your government's frustration and your own frustration with what might be characterized as a certain reluctance on the part of Ontario.
I'm going to be tired.
To engage, especially in the tripartite tables that Minister Blair, I think, had put together. So, Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ssm.can.nsc 402837? This is the readout from a call that you had, Prime Minister, with Mayor Jim Watson on February 8th. Excuse me.
Yeah, there were plenty of federal things that he had to negotiate
just keep
with.
scrolling a bit, Mr. Clerk.
He doesn't necessarily have to give people anything,
onto page 2.
talk to them.
So just to stop there, give a bit of situation. So Mr. Mayor Watson here brings up the expression whack-a-mole, which
I
we've
can
heard
tell you
several
that
times in the
other
commission.
protests have been far
Fighting a
more
losing
disruptive.
battle.
Look into
We
what
don't have enough
went down
police.
with the general strikes.
And you reply
and those
that,
general strikes were,
that's
are
entirely
now
right.
sort of celebrated
I know we're looking
while
carefully at that.
whitewashing
We're
what
looking at the
actually
resourcing.
what they look
And
like.
then you say on the Ottawa policing side, you've seen, as I have, some concerns on how things were handled from the beginning. And then you ask
Thank you
about
for the new membership.
Mayor Watson's relationship with the police chief and how they're working together. And you observe that there are moments where Mayor Watson is saying one thing and the chief is saying another, and ask if there's anything you can do about that. So just briefly before we go on, can you comment on that a little bit and the Ottawa
She's
policing
coughing an
situation
awful
to the
lot.
extent that you were briefed on and aware of it?
One of the things we'd said from the very beginning to the RCMP and to the Commissioner of the RCMP and to government in general, that if there was anything we could do to support the Ottawa Police Services in what they were doing, if we had resources or abilities, because there is a federal presence in
For
in
as
this
much as
capital
I
city.
can. I got.
We should do
I'm
it, that we were
doing
there
work
to
in
be
the evening,
helpful.
but I will pop
instructed
on
Brenda
when
to
I can.
try and
even
do
though I'm gonna be
whatever
super tired.
whatever she could to send support to the city of Ottawa. What we got back, or what we had heard, as I recall, were different numbers from what the mayor said Ottawa needed to what the police chief was saying they needed. And the one thing that the commissioner made clear to me was they needed to know that if they were deploying resources, that they were going to be appropriately used, that there was a plan for that. And we see it sometimes in requests for assistance across the country, where someone will say, "We need 20,000 police officers," or we need the military to come in with 1,000 troops, or we need this or that in RFAs. And part of our due diligence is, okay, what do you need them for? What are you going to be doing them for? Because, for example, if you're sending in military, as we did in Hurricane Fiona, to help clear power lines, as was necessary in Atlantic Canada, in no situation do military members engage in policing activity. And there was a sense that maybe they could be directing traffic. And we have to make sure, no, they're not police. Military isn't there to play police roles. And that's why we always have questions of, okay, we're going to send resources, but we need to know how they're going to be deployed. And there wasn't always that clarity around what the plan was, how many they actually needed, how they were being used, and how they were, where they were going to be best deployed.
Okay. Just keep scrolling down, please, Mr. Clerk. I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I missed it. There we go. So Mayor Watson says, "I'm going to ask after this phone call whether the federal government will live up to its commitment. We need boots on the ground very shortly. It's not dying down. Took over Metcalfe Street, blocked all of it." And you reply, "Listen, yes, you can say the federal government will be there with more resources. But again, the thing that frustrates me, and everyone is conflated, but Doug Ford has been hiding from his responsibility on it for political reasons, as you highlighted. And important, I suppose, it's important that we don't let them get away from that. We intend to support you on that." And Mayor Watson replies, "If they keep dragging their feet, I'm happy to call them out on it. It would be nice if we got something firmed up with the federal government to shame them. Ford didn't even make an effort to come and see what's going on." So can I just ask you, Prime Minister, to comment a bit on the politics that are going on there?
Well, first of all, when I say everyone is, I believe is conflating, it was conflating, a protest of federal issues with a federal responsibility to do the policing that would dissipate that protest. So that was, a little bit of an interplay that there was a sense that in the initial phases of the protest, the Ontario government was happy for the perception to be out there that this was a City of Ottawa issue and a federal government issue, and that as a province, they really didn't have a responsibility.
Still
or
bad optics to have military acting as policing
it was
and so forth.
Unpleasant situation. There were bad headlines. I was getting grumbled at by citizens of Ottawa every day because the federal government wasn't dealing with it. I can understand that provincial politicians who were being overlooked in the complaints everyone had about why this wasn't getting resolved would say, you know what, let's not poke our noses into this, and people will continue criticizing those people that help. I'm fairly certain that behind the scenes, the OPP was engaged with Ottawa Police Services and was providing supports as we were as a federal government. But I think at the political level, there was probably a decision to continue to stay back a little bit and let us wear it a little bit. What we had seen
so part of your motivation is that this is
other crises is when the three orders of government are able to work seamlessly together. Not only does it deliver better results and better coordination, but it actually reassures citizens to see that people who are not always politically aligned at the highest levels can roll up their sleeves and work for the benefit of citizens. And that's certainly something that I've always tried to do, and I've been able to do with Premier Ford on many, many issues. But at this point in the evolution of the occupation, that wasn't something that we were able to do. And so, yes, there was a bit of frustration about it.
Okay, well, and we'll see
Oh,
that
that
the
smug
very next
smile.
day you had a call with Premier Ford, and just in the narrative, what was going on at this point is, in addition to
smile is
Ottawa,
him
and
going,
there were a
"I
few
think I
things,
did
as we
really
know,
well
going
there,"
across,
which
going
is
on
not,
across
I
the country.
think I was
but
really honest there.
by this
It's, you
time,
know,
the 7th, 8th, 9th, the
it's a
Ambassador
sign
Bridge
of,
blockade had really heated up and was in full swing. And that seemed to be a turning point, several ways, but certainly for Ontario's participation in all of this. So, Mr. Clerk, if you can take that document down, please, and bring up ssm.can.nsc 402845.
I think that's accurate. Yeah, I should try to reach out to Spidey and just
So
like,
point for
let's go over
advocacy
Trudeau's
to
testimony.
make a long
Let's go
story short,
over
this is a call
Freeland's.
where it seems that you and Premier Ford are engaging and deciding to work together to solve this problem at this point. We can skip over the first, oh, here we go. The last part of that first paragraph. So PDF, Premier Doug Ford. He says, what we can recommend and what we can work together
Yeah,
on
you
is
do.
I've asked our AG, our Attorney General, to look at legal ways to give police more tools and exhaust legal remedies, because the police are a little shy and I can't direct them. So that's one area we can focus on. We can't take their polar licenses. We checked that. We can shut down their fuel consumption and cordon off highways. That's where we're at. And
Might be operator licenses. I don't.
yeah, probably not polar, but operator licenses. Let's go with that. So then you reply, first of all, they're not a legal protest. They're occupying a municipal street and are not legally parked. You shouldn't need more tools, legal tools. They're barricading the Ontario economy and doing millions of dollars of damage a day and harming people's lives. At a time we're trying to draw in investments, a whole bunch of people are looking at this.
And I don't know of
saying, "We can't
any
even clear up a
protest that
on a bridge."
accomplished
So just stopping
anything
there, Prime
that
Minister.
was
Do you
fully
remember what you
legal,
were
because
referring to when
all
you
of
start talking
the,
about you shouldn't need
you know,
more tools?
there's basically so many laws that I'm probably breaking 3 right now.
I mean, that whole question around legality or illegality of the protest, they didn't have a permit to protest. They not certainly as long as they had.
I mean, if you've got a right,
they were
you shouldn't need
illegally
a right
parked.
or a
They
permit
were
for a right.
engaged in disruptive activities. There are any number of municipal and provincial bylaw infractions and legal infractions that they were engaged in by just being there. And
yeah, and it's
there
pretty
is a
much
sense
impossible to
that,
walk down
you
a
know,
street without
and
committing
this
several
was based
bylaw
on an
infractions.
earlier conversation I had with Bill Blair about how one proceeds in this, is, you know, you can enforce small things as a way of keeping the situation under control and creating boundaries and balances and moving towards it. It's an approach. The issue here was that there were things that they could do and things that I know were tried that they realized were unsafe for them to do. There are stories of police officers getting swarmed there when they tried to arrest someone with a jerry can filled with gasoline. There was a sense
Also
that,
very common at protests that there
giving out
is, you
simple
know,
tickets
these are things
wasn't
that are
really
known
having
to
much of an impact
provoke a protest.
as they did that. And taking stronger measures was going to be resisted and met with significant resistance. But these are things that if they feel they didn't have the resources to enforce a prohibition on bringing in jerry cans or a prohibition of parking on the approach to the
they should, but I'm not entirely
Ambassador
certain on the
Bridge.
rules.
Well, let us give you more resources to do that between the OPP and the RCMP. You know, we should be able to get the numbers up in a way that could lead for an ability to use those existing tools on the books. That was very much where our thinking was at that point. Like how many more police officers, how much more resources do you need to get a plan? And if there was a concern around, well, we can't get those police allocated to us from other jurisdictions, unless there is a clear plan, well, we'll send you planners. We'll help get those people there so you can establish a plan that will allow itself to be deployed. There was really a sense that there was more things that could be done, and he seemed to be agreeing.
Okay, and that's actually what you end up saying in the part you can't see right now of that, the next page, the paragraph.
I am at least consistent.
So nobody, you say the Bridges and Tunnels Act means the federal government has something, I can't read that anymore, but federal government has responsibility over the bridge and border. So there's a role for us to play. We're happy to play it, but nobody can get on the bridge because they're on municipal land being blocked. So we'll give you whatever resources you need. The police of jurisdiction need to do their job. If they're saying they can't do it because they don't have enough officers or equipment, we need to remove that excuse as soon as possible so they can do their work and we can prevent Ontario from becoming a laughingstock. Mr. Clerk, just scroll down to the last page, please. We'll skip over, there's some jurisdictional discussions going on there. And then just at the top of that page, please, Mr. Clerk. So this is the sort of the conclusion of the conversation.
Permission to exercise a right seems odd to me.
You've said the OPP are going in. Are they keeping you apprised, and do they understand the urgency? They can't talk this out for 3 weeks. They need to act immediately. And I'm assuming there the concern of acting immediately is brought about by the situation on Ambassador Bridge, which we heard a lot about from the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday. Premier Ford replies they'll act, but without directing them, it's hard to describe their game plan. They'll have a plan, unlike Ottawa, where they didn't have a plan. I'll get briefed tomorrow from the Solicitor General, would keep you updated. This is critical. I hear you. I'll be up their ass with a wire brush. Then the next, you say, yes, that's one of the quotable quotes of the commission. There have been a few, that's one. The next, your reply there is, well, we're there with resources. Bill Blair will coordinate on our side. You can reach out to LeBlanc, Minister LeBlanc or me. You and I need to work together on this. People will be reassured by the two of us working together. We need to demonstrate this is not a place of lawlessness. Okay, we can take that down. Thank you.
I will say, though, that they can't talk this out for 3 weeks. They need to act immediately. I wasn't just talking about the Ambassador Bridge. I was talking about Ottawa as well. I was talking about the fact that this simply can't continue to be stretched out this way. But when I say they need to act immediately, obviously, I'm not directing the Premier to direct police. We know all the limitations that we have, but there was an expectation that this was a situation that was going on for too long. And as Doug pointed out a couple paragraphs later, there is a sense that the police of jurisdiction had lost control and wasn't able to control the situation.
Okay, that's fair.
There wasn't
I took
violence.
The document down before we got to Ottawa. That's right. Thank you,
rioting
Mr.
or burning of things or anything like that. It was disruptive.
Shifting gears away from Ontario, we understand that there's a lot of concern coming at the federal government from the United States as well. And again, the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday spoke about the many conversations she was having with stakeholders in the U.S. officials, Brian Deese in particular. And we understand that on, I believe, February 11th, you ended up having a phone call with President Biden. Mr. Clerk, we'll just pull up the readout of that call. It's PB.can 6057.
And this being embarrassing on the on the international stage is also not
just scroll down to the next page, please. So maybe that's there. It's got to be somewhere. Keep scrolling until you see a readout. But in the oh no, there it is, I think. In any event, Prime Minister, can you tell us, just the readout doesn't actually say that much. So can you tell us about your recollection of that call?
There were sort of two goals I had in that call. The first one was to reassure him that despite the disruptions to trade and real impacts on both sides of the border, which were economic, yes, but were also people to people. We knew from the pandemic that thousands of healthcare workers cross the Ambassador Bridge every day from Canada to go work in Detroit in their hospitals. There are real meaningful connections across that crossing that were being disrupted in meaningful ways. And I wanted to reassure President Biden that Canada was going to be able to solve for this and that we were going to continue to be a reliable partner for trade and for people-to-people ties and a safe neighbor. That was sort of in response to his concerns around disruptions to activities on both sides of the border because of the blockage. But the second thing I wanted to talk about was just sort of the general context, the fact that the 911 center being overwhelmed in Ottawa a couple of days before happened from American calls, that there was a significant amount of amplification from certain sectors of the American politicosphere. And there was also a significant amount of money flowing and support for these occupation activities in Canada that were coming from people in the United States
that's been
sympathetic to
disproven
that cause
at this point.
and
We know that
opposed to both
small
he
fraction.
and I in our
It was almost
public health
entirely
policies,
Canadian
but
money.
also in our general policies.
Okay. And would you say that President Biden shared your level of concern about the situation?
No. I think I was much more concerned about the blockage to the lives and the disruption and the potential security concerns. I think he was very concerned, but I don't think anyone was more concerned than me.
Okay, fair enough. It was happening on your side of the border, so that makes sense. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. That's it for that one. So this sort of brings us to a pretty critical time in the narrative of what happened in February. So we're building to a bit of a crescendo around that time, the 10th, the 11th. And we've heard from the clerk of the Privy Council that on February 9th, she advised you to convene the incident response group. And the first meeting of the incident response group was then on February 10th. So we have heard quite a bit about the different cabinet committees and what the IRG is, but I'm wondering if you can tell us from your perspective, sitting as Prime Minister and chair of these committees, what it means to convene an IRG and how it differs and what it gives you, what advantage it has
Lots
versus
of people, unfortunately.
Other structures.
Regular cabinet committees are chaired by members of cabinet and feature various
This is
cabinet
basically
members
the
sitting around the table,
pro-Trudeau
assisted
lawyer
by
here.
their directors, their deputy ministers. But they are discussions amongst cabinet ministers on a particular issue that will then go to full cabinet. That's what most committees are. The IRG is a special committee, special in that it is chaired by me. It doesn't have a permanent membership because we deal with incidents that require or are important for the federal government to respond to. These could be floods or hurricanes. The most recent IRGs I've had have been on the situation in Haiti and how Canada can respond and support. We had them around. Have them around all sorts of different things, depending on what they are needed for. We pick the areas of expertise we want around the table.
Yeah, a vote is not worth
differently from most committees
across Canada.
This is these are meetings in which the officials sit around the table and
does she feel like a neutral lawyer?
Not just expected to participate, they actually lead the discussions. Whether it's deputy ministers or heads of agencies, the commissioner of the RCMP, the director of CSIS, what have you, they are giving direct reports. Ministers are usually, if not always, there as well. But if they speak at all, it's at the very end to add a little bit of color or further input. IRGs are all about making sure that the government as a whole is hearing directly, that I am hearing directly from all these different agencies and all these different inputs into whatever incident we're looking at. And then we and then we establish a plan or we move forward on that. It's actually a decision-making body. We can make determinations about what we do next. But that frame is
Sorry, you guys might be able to hear the
fairly
dogs
unique
in the
amongst amongst our committee structure.
So it kind of it collapses that layer between the officials and the ministers a bit. So
Don't worry, I
it's-
won't be
Yeah,
recognized
right
as
access.
official
Directly
CanCon,
from the ministers,
appreciate
which
it.
is sometimes something that cabinet ministers who are used to getting briefed by their officials and then briefing their colleagues takes a little bit of getting used to. When we have a different IRG on a different subject with new ministers who aren't usually at IRGs, it always is a little adjustment for them that no, we're hearing from their deputy minister, not from them. It's about informing us, but it's also about making sure that everyone is on the same page.
good
One of the
dogs.
challenges in any government is the siloing that happens. Something that happens in public safety doesn't necessarily get connected to transport, doesn't necessarily get connected as organically as we'd like to immigration and various things like that. So making sure that everyone's around the table,
CSIS is
getting
fairly
on the
scary
same
if you start
page
looking into
in terms
them.
of what's
Some of the stuff
happening with
they get
this
up to.
incident that we're looking at and
the
what we're
powers
going to
they
do
want
about
to
it.
have.
And there's usually here are the taskings we're going to do. Let's check back in a few days and see how we've done and see where we are again. IRGs rarely happen on a sort of a one-off. There's usually a series of them until the incident is over or has been moved to a different body to weigh in on.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful in understanding. So we know that the IRG that you convened to deal with this particular problem met, first of all, 3 times before invocation, and then I think it met daily after that, but we're going to focus on that first part on the 10th, the 12th, and the 13th. And I'll just fill in a little bit of the narrative so you don't have to here, but we understand that on the 10th, what was discussed was 2 tracks for a potential federal response.
She
so
is,
at this point,
nothing wrong with
say it had been
that.
decided,
It's
but
just
it was certainly
recognize
under
that that's
serious
what's
consideration
going
that
on
the federal
here.
government might have to act in some way, shape, or form here. And track
I'm not
1
faulting her.
was,
This is in fact her job.
what can the federal government do under its existing authorities? Track 2 was what could we potentially do under any new authorities, including the Emergencies Act. And I just want to pause here and ask you one thing, which is in the documents, that's sort of maybe not the first, but it's certainly the first sort of confirmation, official confirmation that the Emergencies Act was under discussion. But we have seen references to the Emergencies Act here and there in various phone calls or emails or discussions, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you can describe, if someone asked you, when did the Emergencies Act come into play as a possibility? How would you answer that?
As an idea, it would have been.
He's like,
from
well,
the
my
very
dad
beginning,
did it,
in the back
and
of our
I've just
minds,
been waiting
is you
for the
see a
opportunity.
situation that
Although his dad did it with the
is
War Measures Act.
an emergency is out of control, has a potential for real impact on citizens, potential for violence, real concerns about what's going on, not just in Ottawa, but right across the country. The Coutts blockade that started up on the same first weekend that the Ottawa occupation did. These are the things that you say, okay, as we look at a whole range of potential outcomes in this, there might be a moment where we have to invoke the Emergencies Act. It wasn't seriously thought of because I will say certainly in my thinking right now, it was a fairly binary reflection. It was, we might have to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no reflection of what we would have to invoke the Emergencies Act to do. It was just understanding that if this situation continues and is unable to get under control by anything else, the federal government might have to give the provinces more powers, give police more powers, do something to put an end to this. So whenever we said, we're looking at all options, it would have been in the back of our minds, particularly because I think we're probably the first government that had ever actually leaned in carefully to maybe using the Emergencies Act as we did in the beginning of the pandemic. We dusted it off and had presentations at cabinet around what the Emergencies Act was and how it was an update from the previous legislation that had existed before and how it was charter compliant. And yeah, because post 1982, a lot of things needed to change for the better in our country with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we got a crash course in the Emergencies Act and the consultations required and all the various steps of it 2 years before around the pandemic. As I had said during the consultations at that time with the premiers, I didn't think we needed to use it. I didn't think it was appropriate for us to declare a public welfare emergency. I believe the section is within the Emergencies Act.
Changed his mind in a real hurry.
Around the pandemic. But there were a lot of people calling for us to do it because it was obviously a national emergency, this pandemic, particularly in the early days of spring 2020. So we were somewhat versed in this legislation that had never been used.
This is going on right now. It's being recorded now.
Particular public order situation, it was a reflection in the back of our minds, or my mind anyway, I can't speak for everyone, that maybe it would end up at this. But for the same reason we were loath to call an IRG too soon in the process, we knew that it wasn't ours to solve at this point, that there were still lots of things that the jurisdiction, the police of jurisdiction and various orders could and should be, orders of government could and should be doing to put an end to this. So it wasn't until, as you say, the IRG of February 10th, Thursday, that we said, okay, track one, what more can we do to empower police and public safety officials to put an end to these illegal occupations? What more resources can we spend with existing authorities? And track two was, what could we do that we would have to create new authorities for, whether it was through regulation, whether it was through passing emergency measures through the House, or whether it was using something like the Emergency Measures Act. And the key for me
using something like a
in
telephone
that conversation was it was a shift from that sort of binary frame of
I feel like the telephone is a lot,
Act or Emergencies Act. Because if you think about it, the Emergencies Act itself doesn't do anything except declare an emergency. It's that it enables government to bring in special temporary measures to deal with the situation. So the useful conversations around the Emergencies Act started on February 10th when I asked the question, okay,
hey, if you're okay with him having an allegation of sexual assault that he's never denied,
we would need to bring in,
that says a lot
either
about
through legislation or through regulation or in various ways, or through the Emergencies Act, that we don't actually have now.
Also note the
what would
lack
we
of
do with the Emergencies Act if we brought it in that we can't otherwise do? And that reflection on, well, what would be the tools actually clarified and got the work going. Perfect example was we had heard consistently throughout that commercial tow truck drivers were not willing to come in and remove trucks. Well, the Emergencies Act perhaps could compel tow truck drivers to come and actually
do we have a word for compelled
contracts that are signed with cities to keep the streets clear of illegal cars. So that reflection was really the one that started then, and the tasking that I gave on that Thursday that we would check in again on the Saturday at the next IRG was, okay, come up with
we have a word for compelled labor. It's not a good word.
That would solve this. And then we'll look at, well, do we need the Emergencies Act to bring in these tools, or can we do it through another way? Or can we convince a province to do it? Or are there other ways of doing it? But let's figure out what are the things that would allow us to get this situation, which was out of control, back under control.
Okay, so that was essentially the discussion around the table on the 12th, I believe. And then the 13th was the big day in terms of deciding as a government whether you were going to take that first step and seriously consider invoking the Emergencies Act. Can you take us through from your point of view, the chronology essentially of the 13th. We know there was an IRG meeting in the afternoon, I think it was 4:30, and the decision coming out of the IRG was to have a cabinet meeting in the evening and to discuss the potential invocation of the act. So how did those meetings play out?
Pendant le groupe de réponse d'incident de ce dimanche,
During the IRG on that Sunday, we took a very close look at the measures that were proposed, the list of tools that we could give ourselves
The
to
list
help
of
the police,
tools
the
we could give
provinces,
ourselves. Yep.
and not only just to get a hold of the situation and control it, but also to prevent them coming back. Because you called this the whack-a-mole.
It's not random. This is
saw
intentional.
that the protesters were very clever when it came to moving around and to have a presence here and then move to another place to give and to turn this into a big challenge for the police and the police response. So the concern,
I mean, they were there for several
if we
days.
put all our
Do you think they're just
resources
gonna
in
sit,
one place,
you know, in one
we could
spot? They're
maybe
gonna move around.
control that situation. But by doing that, another location would become vulnerable. Or once we'd settled one situation, 2 days later, they'd come back. So it was more of a question of, yes, to end the illegal occupations, but also to understand that they had to be maintained and they had to remain clear until the situation calmed down across the country. So during the Sunday meeting, we took a look at the various proposals, whether they be for the tow truck drivers or provisions for certain areas that were prohibited. You couldn't go there to protest there. You weren't allowed to bring children there. You weren't allowed to cross
We're gonna get bots here in a
border.
minute, so I'm just turning that on.
If your objective was to join a group. And there were measures that the banks could take, that they would be able to freeze the assets of the protesters
Without trial,
while they
without
were
anything,
on the
which
sites
should
while
be-
they were barricading and to
which
sort
should
of
be terrifying.
persuade them to go home. So we talked about all these measures.
Like, this is something that should concern
We
you
wanted to see
because,
what
you
our
know,
options to turn those options into reality. Can we pass legislation in the House of Commons? Can we speed things up to have a unanimous consensus, or can we do it quickly? Can we
yeah, I have no problem with
encourage the
him
provinces to
speaking
use more of their
French.
tools?
The issue is
And
that
at
he
that
does it
moment,
to
it
avoid
was becoming pretty clear that the
to avoid sound
situation
bites and to try to, you know,
was
dodge
so
criticism.
urgent,
I think it should be insulting to French speakers.
a fear that it could get
Je parle un
worse
peu de français.
and go into a free fall, and that it was urgent to act. And the tool that we had to quickly bring in those specific tools was the Emergency Measures Act. The other part of the discussion,
because as you well know, you can't just invoke the Emergencies Act. You have to meet a threshold in order to invoke the Emergencies Act. And that brings us to one of the
Which
key
is the
questions.
critical
And
issue here.
I'll ask you about this several times. But what I'm asking you right now is essentially what you can tell us about how that
Yeah,
discussion
he
played
does
out
do this.
in the IRG and the cabinet meeting. And I'll give you a little framing of it, which is,
Yeah,
of course,
nothing wrong
we
with
know
Quebec.
that the declaration of a public order emergency is premised on the existence of a threat to the security of Canada, as defined in the CCIS Act. And we know that CCIS, in the process of assessing the protests, assessed that the protests did not meet that threshold. They did not constitute a threat to the security of Canada as defined in the CCIS Act. So this is one of...
As defined for the CCIS Act.
Okay, please. Over to you.
The legislation in
12-minute pause.
the 80s that was built brought in a definition of a national, a threat to national security, imported the words of the CSIS definition. That was a handy definition that was already existing, and that's how we can define what a national threats to the security of Canadians would be.
This is clearly a very practiced
Those
line.
words in the CCLA Act are used for the purpose of CSIS determining that they have authority to act against an individual, a group, or a specific plot with, for example, a wiretap. That in order for them to take action in a particular situation, that threshold needs to be met of threats to national security. And actually it'd be useful if we could pull up part C of
Sure.
of
You know
the,
what, we have that in 1 second. I will get you the document number. Okay.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Do you want it or do you not?
Yes, I do, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, this is super rehearsed,
COM dot 50954, please. So here, I think this pastes together the three things. So national emergency, public order emergency, scrolling down, you'll see the reference to the CCLA Act, and there, keep scrolling, Mr. Clerk.
Yeah, just, no, sorry,
Nope,
keep it going.
Nope, keep going.
Yep. There we
There
go.
we go.
Good. So in order for CSIS to be able to do a particular operation, it has to meet this matter of threats to the security of Canada. And then they can go and do that wiretap. This definition within a declaration of public order emergency under the Emergencies Act is about the governor and council finding reasonable grounds that there are threats to the security of Canada sufficient to invoke the Emergency Measures Act.
He's weaseling.
So both the context and the purpose is very different. The people doing the deciding, in the case of the CSIS Act, if this is met as a definition,
though.
It's
the
CSIS
same
itself that
language.
decides
This
that
is
this is
just
met.
he
There's
sat
checks
down
and
with
balances
lawyers
afterwards.
to try to
But
come up
for
with a
the purpose
weasel.
of declaration of a public
strategy
order
here.
emergency, it's the governor and council, cabinet, and the prime minister making that determination.
This afternoon
So
will be the first one
context
of many.
within which we look at this definition is very different from the deliberately narrow frame that CSIS is allowed to look at. What inputs it can take in, what proofs it needs to establish this are very well prescribed.
Thank you,
so that
Marie
CSIS
Johansson.
can be,
Or-
so that CSIS is responsible in what it does. Whereas the declaration
Whereas
of
we
public
don't want the
order
government to be
emergency
responsible in what it does.
is open to inputs, sure, from CSIS, but also from the RCMP, also some from transport, from immigration, from the whole of government, from the clerk, from the National Security Intelligence Advisor. So within threats to the security of Canada, what we had to determine was, does the situation going on across the country constitute a threat to the security of Canada? Yes or no? And then we looked at particularly C. Are there activities within Canada directed towards or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective?
If we're going to count this, then
That
we're
was
counting
what we were
every
looking at.
single
Is
protest.
that threshold met? Are there activities supporting the threats or acts of serious violence, a threat of serious
This
violence
is a terrorism provision,
for
folks.
political or ideological
He's saying that
goals?
protests are terrorism.
If
and
that threshold was met in our reasoned opinion, then that part of invoking a public order emergency was met. The other part of it is, does it constitute a national emergency? And there's elements on that I won't get into unless you ask me about. But I was very much focused on, was this bar hit? Yes or no, for the purposes of invoking the Emergencies Act. There has been a bit of back and forth at this commission on whether these words are different or can be read differently or are broader when they're used in a public order emergency than they're used for the CSIS. It's not the words that are different. The words are exactly the same in both cases. The question is, who's doing the interpretation, what inputs come in, and what is the purpose of it? And the purpose of it for this point was to be able to
just trying to weasel
give us
around
this
special really big issue
temporary measures as defined in the Public Order Emergency Act that would put an end to this national emergency.
Okay, so essentially you're saying
okay
that
is like,
around the table
that
day,
BS.
Yes.
you were looking at the inputs that were given to you by officials and by the ministers and concluded that there was activities within Canada.
Threats of serious violence was the key ones.
And can you elaborate on what those threats were? What led to that conclusion?
Yes. And again, we went around the table with officials from all different agencies and heads of departments to talk about this. There was the militarization of vehicles, for example. We'd see.
I'm going to bet that opinion did show
weaponization of
not
vehicles.
to do it, or else they'd be
Cars ramming into police officers or other cars at Coots. We saw an incident like that in Surrey, I believe. We saw trucks used as potential weapons, certainly in Ottawa, with their presence and unknown
every vehicle
interiors.
is a potential
there
weapon.
Was the use
that doesn't mean anything.
Children as human shields deliberately. Which
that's
was
such a
real
BS
concern
line.
both at the Ambassador Bridge and the fact that there were
people,
kids on Wellington Street, that people didn't know what was in the trucks, whether it was kids, whether it was weapons, whether it was both. Police
people
have no
bring
way of
kids
knowing
to protests all
those.
the time.
There was presence of weapons at Coots, as we saw. There was a concern around weapons being stolen in Peterborough that we didn't know, about 2,000 guns that we didn't know where they had gone at that point. We later found out that they didn't go there, but that was a real concern that we had about what was happening to them. There were a number of others as well. There was the fact that police trying to enforce laws were met with active resistance, and
which is again common
police officers trying to
you go up to
someone or arrest someone who was carrying a jerry can into the site in Ottawa, got swarmed by 100 people, and they had to leave because there were threats to their safety, and they weren't able to arrest that individual. There were layers of danger that CSIS kept bringing up to us, that the
every
presence
protest
of people
has,
promoting
like people bring kids to their
ideologically
protests,
motivated
that's what
violent extremism
protesters have kids.
in the convoys.
Look at the train line
had
protests.
a danger of triggering not necessarily them to act, but lone wolf actors.
Human shields implies you plan to shoot at them.
Take actions that
I don't
were
think
violent.
the protesters were expecting people were going to shoot at them.
Increasingly counter protests of people who were trying to take back their city, who were, for example, we all saw images of grandmothers standing in residential streets against massive trucks heading their ways to try and prevent them from coming to join the convoy. There were all these things that positioned or presented real threats of serious violence. And every input we were getting on that weekend at the IRG was that things were not getting better, things were getting worse, even as it looked like there was a plan for the Ambassador Bridge to move forward. It looked like there was going to be a plan for Coots moving forward. it wasn't a sense, there wasn't a sense that things were dissipating. On the contrary, we were hearing about Fort Erie, we were hearing about the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, we were hearing about potential blockades in New Brunswick, we were hearing about potentials at Lacolle, we were hearing more convoys and more supporters heading to different places to take action. There were things
more
going
protests
on in BC and Surrey. Like, there was a sense that this was a broadly spread thing. And the fact that there was not
So if a
yet
protest is
any serious violence,
you know, if there's a
that
lot
had
of
been
people
noted,
protesting,
was
that rises to the Emergencies
obviously a
Act?
good thing, but we could not say that there was no potential for threats of serious violence, for serious violence to happen over the coming days.
There's always
We were seeing
potential when
things
you have people
escalate,
there.
not things get under control.
But that doesn't
Okay,
mean that it's an emergency at this point.
You mentioned
It means you're
there
just
that
imagining
the
dangers.
Ambassador Bridge was on its way to resolution in a sense, and Coots was on its way to resolution. One of the things that's come up in the evidence is that at this juncture,
And everybody knew that at the time.
Ottawa could also perhaps have been said to be on its way, perhaps at an earlier stage, to resolution, in the sense that a plan, an integrated plan for policing and was coming together at that point. And that may not have been something that was clearly expressed on the 13th.
The like, we have
to the
concerns
IRG and/or
justifies just
cabinet.
about
So
anything.
First, I wanted to ask you what your understanding of that situation was at the time.
First of all, from the beginning, from the approach of the very first weekend, we heard from various authorities and police of jurisdiction, don't worry, we got this. There's a plan. There's a plan. And for the second weekend,
But
there
the
was
plan
a plan.
doesn't have to
We have
be
a plan for this,
stopping
and
protests.
It's not going to happen. And we've got this.
Because
We're getting more
protest,
resources. No, there's a plan.
Is a charter right.
We kept hearing there was a plan. And even, I mean, we heard in testimony here that there was a plan on the 13th that the Ottawa Police Services pulled together. I would recommend people take a look at that actual plan, which wasn't a plan at all. It was a talk about using liaison officers to try and shrink the perimeter a little bit. But as you look at the annex for how the troops are deployed, how the police officers are deployed, what resources are going to need, every annex is to be determined later, to be determined later. It was not even in the most generous of characterizations a plan for how they were going to end the occupation in Ottawa. When the plan did come together, and if someone wants to compare the supposed plan on the 13th with the actual plan on the 17th that the Ottawa Police Services pulled together, you see the crisp difference between these are the types of units we need, these are the resources we need, this is how we're going to do it, this is all the stagings of it on the 17th. It was not there on the 13th. But even beyond that, because I'm not fully aware how much of this is hindsight and how much of this was that general sense we got, that people continue to say, oh no, we're going to be able to get this under control. I think, and we're
I hope they
jumping
take
ahead.
a break soon. I need
Jason
a nap
Kenney
and he
was
needs a
saying
diaper change. 'Cause it's
on
starting to
Monday
come out of his
morning
mouth.
in our First Ministers meeting, yeah, Coots is well on its way to being under control. We had heard that before, and there were fluctuations going on in
And
the
in fact,
various,
it was under control
in the various
before
sites
you
across the
used the
country.
Emergencies Act.
It was not enough just to have a plan to clear a couple of lanes. It was getting the situation under control so as to prevent a recurrence or a restaging of a protest elsewhere. And that was what was very clear from all the perspectives around the table, that there was not confidence that we were on a track to getting the national emergency under control in the coming days, that it was continuing to be a situation that was not being
It was continuing to be a
controlled
protest.
by officials.
Okay, so we will get to the First Minister's meeting, but let's just finish off on this point with the 13th. In a lot of the evidence that has come out before the commission, we see hesitancy and reluctance to invoke the Emergencies Act. So officials advising that this may make things worse, this may inflame tension, this may embolden protesters, et cetera. And we also obviously heard from Mr. Vigneault saying, and the CSIS assessment, that there was no threat to the security of Canada under the CSIS Act.
Because there
and then
wasn't
we
a
heard
threat.
Mr.
It
Vigneault
was,
say,
you
but I
know,
still
it
thought
was
that the
obnoxious,
act
it
was
was
necessary,
annoying, it
and
was
I conveyed that to
disruptive.
the Prime Minister.
All of those
So
things.
can you tell us, was there consensus on the use of the act? What did you hear about whether or not people agreed with this interpretation, whether you should invoke the act?
Yes, there was consensus around the IRG table.
Yeah, this is
Sunday,
common on
13th.
at protests,
There is no
and
question
it's
about
not
it. And
human shields.
Director
It's
Vigneault's
just you're blocking traffic.
answer on that
Human
is
shields implies
absolutely
people are
consistent.
shooting at them, or that
CSIS,
you're going
for
to drive
example,
through the crowd.
Wouldn't
which
feel
you
that
shouldn't
they
ever
had the
be doing.
capacity to bring in a wiretap against one of the convoy organizers under the CSIS Act, because that the tools that they have and the threshold they have to meet for what is a threat to the security of Canada, according to CSIS's evaluation, was not met. And that was something we heard from the very beginning. CSIS continued to say from the beginning of the protest, we haven't yet, under the CSIS Act, reached the level of
I've been
threats to
stupid
Canada.
busy.
But the director of CSIS is also one of the national security advisors to me. And in looking at the frame and scope of the situation we were in, was very comfortable in saying, yeah, for the purposes of the CSIS Act, this is not met. But for the for purposes of the Public Order Emergencies Act that the Governor and Council has to make a reasonable decision about, we
I've
feel
never
that
met
it is
Pat
met.
King.
And
I don't
that
really
was the
have any
consensus
particular-
from officials around
It's
the
not
table.
likely to
And
happen.
again,
Um,
it was about not even just sort of that binary, okay, do we declare the emergency or not? It's, do we declare a public order emergency so that we can bring in these specific measures? And as we went around the table on that, and my expectation is, and that was a virtual table, I believe, but my expectation is always, if you have significant disagreements, this is the time to speak up. There was no voice saying, hold it, we don't think you should do this, or I don't think you should do this.
That's because you filled a room with dumb people.
Which does happen from time to time in cabinet meetings and in IRGs.
You having a
And,
room full of yes men is
if
not
someone had come
a
up
selling
and said, okay, we don't think, us at Transport Canada, we don't think that we should invoke a public order emergency, I would have said, thank you. I would take in that into account. But I didn't need unanimity or full consensus in order to make the determination in Governor of Council according to that we were moving forward. Obviously, it helped. And in this case, there was
his handlers
consensus
took away
around
his
that
shoe
table
polish. He's not
that
allowed
invoking the Emergencies Act
anymore.
was what we needed to do.
And when you say that, are you speaking of the IRG in the afternoon or the eventual cabinet meeting in the evening?
I'm speaking of the IRG right now, with where we went around the table with officials, but we did a similar thing that that evening with the cabinet meeting. But I can talk about that if you.
Yeah, that's the segue. So please do tell us about the cabinet meeting.
Alors, à la rencontre du cabinet de ce soir.
So on that evening, the cabinet met and we submitted the conditions that needed to be met to invoke the act.
These people are your best friends, the people who will tell you that you are
And we
idiots.
discussed at length of the tools that were needed and of the, I believe, 6 provisions that could bring to an end to this situation. 6 elements that could not be invoked by other means, but calling this law on emergency measures, this act. So there was a healthy discussion around the table. Every minister who wanted to express themselves did so. And I won't go into that detail, but I can say that there was consensus, clearly. Consensus that I had to move on and consult the premiers.
Yeah, given how he
and move
punishes
on to
dissent,
invoking the act.
the fact that everybody was,
We did not decide on
was
invoking the
agreeing
act
with him is
then,
just because he
but
doesn't
I
allow
could
disagreement.
hear the reactions, just as I did before the same day with the IRG meeting, that people felt comfortable enough and together enough on this issue.
Because it is.
Yes,
He's doing
we
it
could
for a reason.
next day.
Whether the threshold was met. Is that part of the discussion at the
Yeah,
cabinet
it's a
table
tactic
as
to
well?
avoid being quoted on
Oui.
certain things,
Okay.
at least in
Et-
Western
Et
Canada
après,
and in
et
Ontario.
enfin, vous avez eu le même sorte de consensus.
Yes, you made the same consensus then.
So that brings
Yes.
us to what we can loosely call Decision Day, February 14th. And I'm just going to try and lay out the chronology of that day and then ask you, first of all, whether that is the correct chronology of the day, and then ask you to speak to various parts of it. So the first minister's, the decision coming out of cabinet the evening before was to convene a first minister's meeting to have the obligatory consultation under
I
section
would love to
25
have
of the Emergencies Act
JWR on my
before it could
channel,
be
but I don't
invoked.
think
And we
she'd.
know that late
I don't
that
think
night,
she'd
an
join.
invitation was sent out to the premiers to that meeting. That invitation did not include the subject of the meeting, and we've heard some of your ministers and officials speak to why. But in any event, so the first ministers' meeting was held, I believe, at 10:15 the following morning on the 14th. Following that meeting, you had a call with opposition leaders, I believe, and a call with your own caucus.
No.
No. Okay.
The caucus call was before the first minister's meeting.
Thank you. Okay.
I wanted to make sure that we shared with our members of caucus who were going to be involved in, well, very much a part of a government that has or would invoke the Emergency Measures Act. I wanted to let them know before premiers were consulted. I wanted to let them know that I was about to consult the premiers, but the sense was that caucus should hear it before the premiers heard about that.
That makes sense. Okay, so caucus call first, then first minister's meeting, then I think you spoke to opposition leaders.
I agree.
Then around
Article
3:41
337
p.m. I said
or
around,
Section
but we actually know the
337 of the
minute.
Criminal Code
3:41
was
p.m.
a
you
great
receive
section.
advice
It was
from the clerk,
underused.
and that
and
advice,
now
as
it's
we know,
unfortunately
is
gone.
that they recommend that the clerk recommends that you invoke the Emergencies Act, and shortly thereafter there's a public announcement of it. So just unpacking that, starting with the caucus call briefly, but the focus of this will obviously be the first minister's meeting. Take us through that day.
The caucus call was informing them that I was about to go into a first minister's meeting in which I was going to present them with the fact that we were thinking about invoking the Emergencies Act. And I shared with them that these were the kinds of things that we would be giving police and various various officials and authorities which tools would be able to move forward with that. So I presented it. It wasn't a big discussion. I wasn't looking for consensus. There wasn't a lot of feedback. It was just informing them that we were taking this seriously and moving forward. And I dare say the response was very positive from
Quebecois French
caucus.
is hard, I will say that.
Then the first minister's meeting. As I'd mentioned earlier, this was not the first time I talked about the Emergencies Act with the premiers. I think as Ms. Telford had talked about yesterday, I have had many first ministers meetings over the course of the past 2 years to deal with the pandemic emergency. And we have always worked very constructively together. And for me, being able to sit down with them and highlight that we were seriously considering invoking the Emergencies Act in order to do the following things.
That'd be the end of my day.
And I wanted to hear from them. And then I went around the table across the country to hear from each of them on their reflections, their inputs, their concerns, their support, their disagreements in some cases, but really wanted to hear what it was that they were going to be what their thinking was on this situation that would, by definition, affect all of them on a situation that was, to a certain extent, affecting all of them. At the end of that meeting,
Yeah, I mean, the outcome of
reached
this is
out to
predetermined.
The opposition leaders had
This
conversations
is a
with
dog
them
and pony
about,
show to get to a
what I
particular
was
result.
reflecting on doing, and asked for their support. And then started preparing for a potential announcement that afternoon as the note from the clerk came in, making the official recommendation to the government that we invoke the Emergencies Act.
Okay, so let me start with an initial question, taking you back to first thing in the morning. Had you made up your mind already?
No.
Yeah, that's not an honest answer.
I was a long way down the road of realizing that it was probably the path we needed to take, but I did
Just
not
be
make
honest,
up my
you wanted
mind
to do it
until
to,
the note from the clerk was in front of me, and it was in
he
black and white.
like
that the,
quoted his dad on this one.
public service.
He just
made a formal recommendation that I invoke the Emergencies Act.
I feel
If
that
I'd
he
gotten
wanted
to
to
that
do
point
it
and they
to
had,
sort of as a
said,
shout
no,
out
we still
or
don't
a
think the threshold
throwback
is
to his
met.
dad.
It is possible that we wouldn't be here today, and I would not have invoked it, but I don't know. But the fact that when that note came in, I made that final decision with all the conversations, all the inputs, and all the feedback that I'd gotten from caucus, from cabinet, and from first ministers and opposition leaders, and all the officials I'd talked to. That was when I made the decision.
So
I
going
will
back to
have
the
to make a
first
video on
ministers'
that at
meeting,
some
then
point
we
in the
understand
not
it
too distant
lasted
future.
about an hour, and all of the premiers had a chance to voice their opinions.
Thank you,
and their
Ryan 432. I
concerns,
will
but
make a video
is
about
there
the
anything they could
vandalism
have
of the
said or done at
excavators.
that point to change your mind?
Absolutely. If
I'm feeling that, but
someone had said,
I'm on YouTube. I can't can't do that.
Listen, I hear those 6 things you're planning on doing. You don't need them, because these are the tools we're going to use instead. We have the power. We're going to be able to, in Ontario, do this, and we're confident that that will end the situation in
The
Ottawa.
fact that you've tried nothing
end
and
the
you're all out of
situation
ideas
at
does not
potential blockades
justify
for
the
keep us
Emergencies
safe.
Act.
You don't need to bring in
This
compelling
is like,
tow truck
hey,
drivers,
there's
because
a homeless guy
we've
sleeping on
figured
my
out how to
lawn.
do it for good.
I asked him to
We
leave,
have
and
a
he said
plan to
no,
put
so I
an
shot him
end to
6
this
times in the
in
head.
a concrete and compelling.
You can't do
a lot
that.
of plans up until that point.
But he's doing the civil
But
liberties
if I had been
equivalent of
convinced
this.
that other orders of government or any other law in Canada was sufficient to deal with this emergency, then we wouldn't have met the threshold, because part of the threshold for the Emergencies Act is and is unable to be dealt with under any other measures or laws in Canada. And if they had said convincingly, or enough of them had said, no, you don't need it because we have it under control, which is to a certain extent what they all said to me when I had this conversation with them around the pandemic. I said, listen, there's a lot of pressure for us to look at the Emergencies Act. Do we need to bring in the Emergencies Act? And they all said, no, don't bring in the Emergencies Act. We've got it under control. We're able to do this in our own jurisdictions, in our healthcare systems. We don't need to do it. Public order emergency is different than public welfare emergency, but that principle was there, and we didn't invoke the Act back in the spring of 2020. So yes, they could have said things that prevented me, that would have said, okay, let's give it a few more days, or let's not do this at all. They said lots of things, but that threshold that I had personally wasn't met.
Oh, your personal
And you
threshold,
mentioned,
as opposed to the legal one,
express
which
opinions around
CSIS
the lines
said
of, well, we kind of got it under control here. This problem isn't really cropping up here, or it's cropping up here in a way that our law enforcement
he's
can
acting.
deal with. So are you drawing a distinction there between, okay, the premiers may say it's under control here, but that doesn't mean it's under control everywhere. So they would have had to come to you with something that would have solved the big problem as you saw
I kind
it.
of
Is
do.
that-
I feel like I want to go
think there
on
just would have been
Nick's channel. I haven't been
a
there
sense that
in a while,
that the measures I
but
was
just to
proposing
rant about
weren't
this.
going to be useful or effective.
I'm gonna have to watch Viva later on that.
And what I heard on the contrary was concerns that we'd shared that this might inflame the protesters to declare a public order emergency and bring in martial law, which was one of the concerns, or that they would interpret it as that. Of course, it wasn't martial law, and it did not suspend people's fundamental rights and freedoms. But it at the same time, they expressed these concerns, which we had shared, but I was balancing off against, okay, there is a danger of further inflaming the situation, but the situation was already pretty inflamed, and my concern was if we continue to not do anything, are enough citizens going to start counter-protesting and taking things into their own hands at various places across the country that we do get into dangerous, violent situations. Even Premier Moe, I believe, and we could pull it up, but I think people have seen it a few times, highlighted that he didn't have any real, that the 6 elements we had seemed reasonable enough, but he was in disagreement with the invocation of the Emergencies Act, that those 6 elements we should maybe move forward with in some way, but without doing the Emergencies Act. That was something that we'd looked at trying to do as well. But it was clear that in order to do those, bring in those tools, the Emergencies Act was the vehicle that was created for that purpose so that we could respond to a national emergency. Jason Kenney, I believe, said, I'm not going to quibble with the use of the act, but we don't need it here in Alberta. And that was something that came out a number of times, even by those who were supporting it, said, yeah, you do what you need to do. Don't think we need it here, but I know this is a situation where you should probably do it. Or can you not do it in my jurisdiction and just do it for Ontario? And that was certainly something that,
Chat, should I buy a leather clicker?
I had reflected on, and certainly reflected on further through that conversation. But the reality is there were pop-ups and troubling reports right across the country that we were getting from all of our various inputs. There was a financing of these convoys that was coming from every corner of the country and internationally. These were things that
the international aspects of it
generalized
so
across
minor.
the country, and therefore required a use of the Emergencies Act. Par exemple, le Premier ministre Legault a exprimé.
Premier Legault expressed some concern. He didn't want to have the RCMP suddenly take over all the police interventions and operations in Quebec when he thought he didn't need that. And I was able to reassure him. And it's something that I actually incorporated in my communication subsequently, that it was there to be used if necessary. But if, for instance, there was a blockade at Lacolle and the SQ is perfectly able to deal with it, like they responded very well at the second weekend at an attempted convoy in Quebec City. The RCMP was only there to be a support if necessary. And that was the framework. So it was a very useful conversation. And I heard a lot of points of view. And it was a good thing for me to be able to hear them, even with different opinions.
Even with different opinions.
Just to reassure what I was doing.
One very quick question, then we're done with this entire part. It's the
thank God
last
on the
question
break.
I want to ask you about that day, Prime Minister. So at 3:40, you received the decision note from the clerk. We call it the invocation memo. Technically, it's a decision note. And presumably you read it.
Yes.
Okay. And Was there anything in it that surprised you? Was that the advice you were expecting to get from the clerk, or was it?
It was the advice that was consistent with the consensus around the table the day before at the IRG. The clerk and the National Security and Intelligence Advisor and the deputy clerk and all the heads of departments and agencies had a chance to weigh in on the various measures and on the invocation. And there was a clear consensus coming out of there that this is what we should do. But it was a big thing, not a small thing, to have the head of the public service formally.
That's the only time he's ever heard that.
Recommend the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the declaration of a public order emergency. It's not something that had ever been done in Canada before.
Yeah, this was
certainly not
particularly
something
gross.
that we undertook to do lightly. And as a prime minister, I get to sign off and agree with these notes, or in some cases disagree with them. And that was a moment that I took with the weight of the decision I was about to take. And I reflected briefly on, first of all, the reassurance that it gave me that the entire system, all the inputs in the system had come up to the clerk of the Privy Council.
I support
top
people's
public
right to
servant in
go march
Canada,
in the street and say
impartial,
Runkle sucks. If that's what
professional
they want to have a
public service,
protest on.
making the recommendation to move forward on
Like
this
if you want to,
was essential to me. But I also reflected on, okay,
I mean, I hope people don't protest
What if I
that,
don't
but
sign it?
What
if I say, okay, we now have advice from the professional public service to invoke a public order emergency. And I decide, you know what? Let's give it a few days. Where the professional public service had made a determination that the thresholds were met, that the use of it was appropriate and, responsible, and the measures were the right ones that we were going to put in it. And I said, no, you know what? Let's wait and see another few days, another week to see if we really need to do it. First of all, what if the worst had happened in those following days? What if someone had gotten hurt?
What if it happened
what if
today?
A police officer had been put in a hospital? What if when
you
I had
can't
an
suspend
opportunity
civil
to do
liberties
something,
on what if.
I had waited.
What if is
and
always there.
We had unthinkable happen over the coming days, even though there was all this warning that it was possibly coming. I would have warned that in a way that we would certainly be talking about in a forum such as this.
Gee, this would be
But
embarrassing
more
for
than
you.
that,
Let's shut down civil liberties. We wouldn't want a politician to be
the
embarrassed.
responsibility of a prime minister is to make the tough calls.
It's to
and keep
protect
people
civil
safe.
liberties a lot of the time. That the
And
tough
this was a
call
moment
is protecting liberty.
where the collective advice of cabinet, of the public service, and my own inclination was that this was a moment to do something that we needed to do to keep Canadians safe. And knowing full well that this was an inevitable consequence of me signing, I agree, on this note, I was very comfortable that we were at a moment where this was the right thing to do. And we did it. And it is a certain amount of comfort that, first of all, the system is working as it should, that people who are defending civil liberties are able to say, you really should be careful about doing this. Maybe you shouldn't have done it. That we have a system pushing back on this because it's a big thing, not a small thing to do this. But that also we were able to solve the situation with it. That there was no loss of life. There was no, serious violence. That we were able to get neighborhoods back under control, border services opened, and there haven't been a recurrence of these kinds of illegal occupations since then. I'm not going to pretend
no
that it's the
kidding.
only thing that could
Nobody's
have done
likely
it,
to protest if they realize that you're
did
going to
do
go like
and
full.
that colors the conversations we're having now.
Like this
with
is the whole
fact that
point,
these
is
could be
that
very
it's going
different
to make it
conversations,
protest
and
very
I
difficult
am
and unlikely.
absolutely,
It's had a
absolutely
massive chilling
serene
effect on
and
that.
confident that I made the right choice in agreeing with the invocation.
Mr. Commissioner, definitely a good time for a break.
Okay, so we'll take the morning break. We'll take 15 minutes, please.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La commission levée pour 15 minutes.
All right, so we got 15 minutes for a bit of a rant. And so here's my little bit of a rant. Everybody looks at history and they like to assume that they would be on the right side of history. Like they look at the picture of the little girl being brought into a school post Brown and Board of Education, and they like to imagine that they're going to be one of the people who is holding that girl's hand and providing her comfort, and not one of the angry people in the crowd shouting at her. They look at the video, they look at pictures of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and imagine that they would be helping the sit-in and not one of the people leaning over those protesters and yelling at them. And I like to think that too about myself. I like to think that I would, stand up for the righteous causes. But I don't know that. Like, I don't know that I wouldn't have been the product of my, whatever. And so I don't know that I would necessarily be on the right side of anything, because lots of people weren't. And lots of people who considered themselves to be good, upstanding people made the wrong call on that. And, I'm not cutting them a break or anything. I'm just saying this is a real possibility. And because I recognize my own fallibility on this sort of thing, I recognize that I could be wrong. Like I am not perfect by any stretch. I think that it's very important to support protests, including ones I absolutely disagree with, because that is the principle that at the end of the day gets me to where I would want to be on a lot of these issues. So with that, when I look at the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, I can't say necessarily if I had grown up in that environment that I would have been like, okay, I am behind this. I like to think I am. Now looking at it from the luxury vantage point of 2022, I think it's absolutely the right, thing. But, the principle that means that I would absolutely have taken the right stance at the time is a principle of protest, even protests I disagree with. So I caught flack during the train blockades for saying, you know what, this is a protest, and protests suck. Protests can be super inconvenient, but that doesn't mean bring out the army every time. Lots of people were going, hey, Runkle, what the hell? And I'm like, protest, it's a thing. And then the opposite people, so the people who thought that that was a great stance with regards to the train protests, turned around and really disagree with me when I say the same thing about the convoy. And this doesn't mean that I agree with the underlying principles of either protest. It just means I think that we should actually have protest, right? That protest. And the other thing I'm going to point out is that historically, all of the protests that we celebrate are protests that were incredibly destructive. Like when we talk about union rights and so forth, which nowadays most people, and I say most, I recognize that this is, not uncontroversial, but most people support a lot of the stuff that, that those got in terms of like weekends, workplace protections, those kinds of things. But those were obtained through strikes, at like general strikes. And general strikes if you think that the convoy protest is bad, look up what they were doing in general strikes, because they would, for instance, decide which stores could be open. And if you wanted to open your store and you weren't on the approved list because you're not selling groceries, you're selling, novelty beanies or whatever that people don't think are important, they would threaten to burn down your store. If you look at like mine strikes and what were involved in those, they were violent. There was, people having, major conflicts. I see people on the left who are just up in arms about like, oh, the convoy was so noisy. People couldn't sleep with all the honking. Well, great. Stonewall, started with somebody throwing a brick. And I don't think you can say, hey, I celebrate protest. If you only celebrate protest when you agree with the underlying cause, you run the very real risk that you will be wrong, that you will end up on the wrong side of history. I can't say that I would have supported Stonewall at the time because the press coverage certainly wasn't favorable. And largely this was something that motivated people in that community to more action. But outside of that community, it largely galvanized people against them. That was the historical sort of thing there. Now, again, protest isn't always nice. It isn't always polite. It isn't always. And when you've got a protest that is disruptive, you can, that's sort of how things happen. The Rodney King riots were riots. Like that was a riot. But lots of people say, and that, hey, they were kind of a reaction to horrible brutality that was going on there. And that this was the voice of the people on that. So, this is not an easy thing. Freedoms and liberties often suck for somebody. If I've got property rights to build whatever I want on my lawn, and I might decide to, erect a giant statue of a dong, and that's going to annoy my neighbors, right? But it is still my liberty. Every liberty, people say, the right to liberty ends when your fist hits my nose, but it has to be an actual fist. It can't just be the right, your liberty ends when it starts to annoy me, because most people out there exercising various freedoms annoy me. If I get on Twitter, I will see so many dumb takes, and, a lot of them just, I'm like, why do you exist? Person with this take. Why do you exist? Well, I still think that they should be able to, like, they should be able to have those dumb takes. So people are like, do you agree with the convoy? It's like, does it matter? Does it matter here when we're talking about the suppression of it? Think about this down the road, because if you disagree with the convoy, there's definitely going to be a protest down the road that you agree with. And now we've opened the door for this kind of massive shutdown of these protests. The Liberal Party is not going to be in power forever. They keep having scandals and they're pretty good at dodging them. But eventually one of those scandals is going to stick. Eventually one of those scandals is going to land and there will be a change in power. And do you, if you really if you love Trudeau and he is your favoriteest person ever, are you going to be happy with Pierre Poilievre exercising these powers? Are you going to be happy with him having the power to suspend your bank accounts? Maybe not. I don't want this power for any politician. People say, oh, you don't like Trudeau, so you must like Poilievre. I don't want Poilievre to have this power. I don't think any politician should have this power. People say, I'm worried, if I was Prime Minister of Canada, I wouldn't want me to have this power because I might be tempted to use it. And, this is the concern, is that once a government has a power, they love to use it, and they love to use it more and more and more. And, sometimes the limitation on power is tradition, in the sense of like the government has had this power, but it's traditional not to use it. We see that with the notwithstanding clause, right? That it's politically dangerous to invoke it. And, that's why we don't see the notwithstanding clause invoked all that often. In fact, Ford recently had to back away from it because it's unpopular. But once it becomes okay, once it becomes commonplace, once you start to open that door, it's going to get more and more and more likely. So whenever you're gauging a government power, like should the government have this ability, don't think of the current government and don't think of a government you like. Think of the worst government you've ever thought of. Think of Harper if you don't like Harper. Think of Mulroney if you don't like Mulroney. Think of Chrétien if you don't like Chrétien. Think of like whichever government of Canada you think has been the worst government of, your lifetime. Think of that one with this power and then evaluate it. Because if you say, hey, I'm concerned about this other government having this power, then you should be concerned about any government having it. Government isn't like, you can't just hand government a sword and expect it to only be used against your enemies. You go, hey, government, have this knife. And then once the government has that, they can stab your enemies, but also you equally well with it. That is how those powers work. So, this is the same reason why I oppose the censorship bills that we're seeing being pushed through. This is the same reason why I oppose, the Patriot Act. I see somebody referencing in the chat, like I don't want the government to be able to decide to shut down protests arbitrarily. Too many of the rights that we consider essential, fundamental at this point, have come from protests, and protests that make the convoy look like a wet firecracker. Yeah, it's concerning, right? And I see Zachary's mama. I don't like Trudeau, but I dislike Poilievre worse. This is the first time it's been used. It won't be the last. Wait until it did get violent. Then people would have been pissed that they didn't do something. I'd rather that they waited until there was something happening that required it. Because then, like if you're wondering why the riot cops weren't doing anything, it's because the optics of going in and starting to bash heads when people were sitting there with bouncy castles was real bad. That's a major reason on this. We typically don't shut down speech until people do something. In the same way that a cop can sit there, if a cop pulls up and I'm staring real hard at a house, they can sit there and do precisely nothing until I decide I'm going to break into the house. Like the instant I pull out a crowbar and start going up to the front door, they can probably do something about it. But if they just don't like how I'm looking at this house, they don't get to go, oh, well, we think that, we think he's going to, break into this house because he looks at it real bad. And he could break into it. Yeah. Thank you, $5 for the dong statue fund. I will tell you right now, my wife would not let me build a giant dong statue in the front yard. Just that one is a freebie. She's also going to, she's gonna put her foot down soon about the beard and mustache. And to be honest, I'm kind of finding that they annoy me at times. So yeah. Yeah. I see exactly why a real protest will pop up without a permit. The ones with a permit are a political agenda. I don't know about political agenda, but you know, a lot of the historical protests have come about based on a moment in time. In the sense of like Stonewall was not like a pre-planned thing. It was a reaction to a police raid. And yeah. Just say the dog is a rocket. I didn't marry a dumb woman. She is not, she's not gonna, so yeah. I see he totally read that wrong. Dong. Yes, dong. Yeah. All right. I see some, further comments here. It's like somebody noting possession of break-in tools. That's a complicated section, and it's often hard to prosecute somebody who is simply found with tools. Because if you're just, for instance, found on a bus with a crowbar, I mean, you could be going to break into houses, but you could just be, taking your crowbar home. All right. Looks like they're getting started. I see Axolotl. I was at Oka. I don't think paperwork would have been respected either way there. Please shoot me a message on Twitter. I would love to talk to you because I sort of have some Oka discussion possibly in the works. So please shoot me a message. I would love to chat with you. Somebody's saying, I heard you say dog. She would be fine with a dog statue. It's not just no dong statue. That would be a different thing there. Have I seen the Blue Origin rockets? They somehow managed to make rockets even more phallic. That's hard because
Order alert.
Yep. All right, they're back in business here.
The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Bon. Alors, on reprend. Allez-y.
Yeah, the protests in
You mentioned
France
before
are
the
not
break that
being polite
you
either.
thought it was a good thing that commissions like this one are here to challenge
He's
your
never going to be
decision
held
to
responsible
invoke
for
the
anything.
Emergencies Act. I'm about to put that to the test because, as you can imagine, that decision has come under a lot of criticism, and we've heard a lot of that criticism over the last 6 weeks of these hearings. So I'm going to put to you some of the criticisms that we've heard, and I'd like to hear your answers on them. The first one is, well, actually, the first one was that the threshold wasn't met, but I think we've covered that. We don't need to go over that one again. The second one is that invoking the Emergencies Act was executive overreach. It's an anti-democratic act.
It exists because it was debated and voted on in Parliament many years ago, but duly written into the books and the laws of Canada as
doesn't
a
mean that
tool
you just
available for
can invoke it just because
a
you're,
situation around emergencies like this.
No, it wasn't for emergencies like this. It was for like the FLQ
It
crisis,
requires,
and specifically to say that the
they're
FLQ
written for
crisis wasn't
situations
enough
where
for it.
the emergency or the urgency requires a government to have tools to put into place in unforeseen
It was
circumstances
generally considered that
that can't
using
be
the War Measures Act in the FLQ
anticipated
crisis was too far.
years or decades in advance. But that's why it was an important debate when it was brought in. And that's why there are mechanisms afterwards to ensure that it was not used erroneously or lightly. First mechanisms, votes, a vote in the House. Next one, a parliamentary committee designed to look into it. Third one, and most importantly, this process itself, which is a really important one that I knew from the moment I invoked that we were going
Yeah,
to
and I
end
think
up
this
in a
is
room
really
such as this
a
doing
better
this
plan
work.
is wait and then,
And I
be
would
on
have to
standby. If stuff goes
explain,
bad,
and
then you
we
can
as a
respond
government
to
would
it.
have to explain and justify this decision to Canadians, because the use of special temporary emergency powers is something that Canadians need to be reassured is within the rules and the principles of our democracy. And that's exactly what this is.
Do you think the accountability mechanisms work? Is this a proper check on that power, in your view, sitting in your chair right now?
Sitting in this chair and having watched the questions posed of officials and ministers and now me, I can say that it's not something that any government would undertake lightly. This is a serious process where there is
We'll
a
just do it the
serious
next time
challenge
there's a
function being
protest
exercised,
against
as it
us.
should be. As to whether it's the best way of doing things, this law was brought in almost 30 years ago. There's always ways of reflecting on doing it differently or better, but that'll be the will of the House, and that'll be based on perhaps recommendations by the Commission. But
I disagree.
think this
FLQ could be
process
dealt
works.
with by the police and
Okay.
largely work.
The second or another criticism that's been leveled or challenge that's been made is that it wasn't really necessary. The situation would have resolved itself. And in the end, the way things played out, the declaration was made the 14th, the orders came in the 15th, and then by the 23rd, it was revoked and everything was solved. And many of the measures put in were never even used. So how do you respond to that? You didn't actually have to do it. It wasn't a necessary measure at the time.
It's hard to prove a hypothetical that if we hadn't done it,
But you're relying on the
things could have
hypothetical
been
of,
resolved. Perhaps it would have gotten
things-
much worse. My
so you err on the side
role
of rights.
was to make what was the responsible call in keeping Canadians safe. The act was used in many different ways, and far from being, as you perhaps suggest,
Those who
a
would give
proof
up
point that it
essential
wasn't
liberty
needed, that it was
to purchase a
only
little
in place
temporary
for
safety
such a short period of time.
deserve neither and will lose both.
I think that goes to the fact that it was needed and it was effective in actually doing, with as light a touch as we thought we could have,
Yeah, a video's coming out on this later.
a resolution to this ongoing situation and emergency.
Okay.
That's correct.
There's also an argument made that this invocation, you were dealing with an act that has never been
Mohawk
invoked
land,
before,
but-
and now it has been. And there's a possibility that this invocation of the act will then open the floodgates, in a sense, to the act being used again and again and again, in particular
bad
because,
idea there.
and we have your point on this, but you invoked it in a circumstance where the threat to the security of Canada had not been found by CSIS. So does this, in effect, open the floodgates to the Emergencies Act being used by a
Yes.
decision by the executive in all kinds of circumstances?
But CSIS isn't the decision maker in a matter of public order emergencies.
No, but they are able to evaluate the standard.
Use of the definition in the CSIS Act, as I said before, has two very different contexts, from the use of it by CSIS and the use of it in invocation of a public order emergency. Context is different, the purpose is different, the decision maker is different. The requirements around it, the inputs are different. And the fact that the director of CSIS, while consistently saying it doesn't yet meet the CSIS threshold for CSIS to act in wiretapping people or whatever it is still something that is necessary for a public order emergency.
But do you worry about the floodgates aspect of this, that having done this, you've now maybe unleashed the Kraken?
You should, because it'll be
I think,
used
first of
against
all,
your
the
supporters in
excellent
future.
work this commission and all the cross-examiners have been doing over the past number of weeks highlights that it's not something to be undertaken lightly. And I didn't need to have seen this commission to consider this very much to be a measure of last resort. This wasn't something we were eager to do. And I dare say that
You dare say.
future governments are likely to look at this experience and say, yeah, no, it's not really not something we want to go through lightly. But the law is on the books to assist in dealing with national emergencies. And the determination was made by the governor and council, by the professional public service, that the thresholds were met and that this was necessary. And regardless of any setting of precedents, I think it would be the worst thing for me to say, even though the thresholds have been met, even though it is needed and necessary, we're not going to do it because someone might abuse it or overuse it in the years to come. When there's a national emergency and serious threats of violence to Canadians, and you have a tool that you should use, how would I explain it to the family of a police officer who was killed, or a grandmother who got run over trying to stop a truck, or a
Trudeau
protester
could
who
kill
was
a
killed?
police officer tomorrow.
If
How
I
do we
hadn't used the
explain that
tools,
if we don't throw him in
one
jail?
of the protesters, one of the occupiers, had been killed in
This applies to
violent
literally
clash
every
with someone
protest
else.
ever, right? Any
Getting this
protest could have
situation under
somebody
control
there take out an
protecting the
officer.
safety of all Canadians.
This
is a
applies to
priority.
any protest. If this is the standard of
On the same
maybe
theme, but
somebody could
slightly
go after a
different,
cop, then there is no
the act
protest that
was
can't be
invoked
shut
here in
down.
response to a protest, and protest is a very important part of functioning democracy. And you touched on this on one of your answers before the break, but does this open the door then to the Emergencies Act being regularly used as a tool to quell protest? Because protest is not necessarily clean. Protest can be messy and it can be problematic, and it can interfere
actually
at
like
times
this
with critical
question.
infrastructure. We think of Indigenous protest, environmental protest. So
Yep.
what stops this from being used against that?
Nothing whatsoever.
Again, the checks and balances we have
I
and
will
the
have a look at that in
need
a
to
moment.
demonstrate and meet a high threshold. But also from experience, over the past 7 years, we've seen many protests and disruptions across this country, including protests of, as you say, critical infrastructure and economic importance. And it never occurred to me or to the government to invoke the Emergencies Act around any of those. Now, your point around maybe future governments will run to it as a tool now that the seal has been broken. But I have greater faith in Canadians and in our institutions than the fact that we might sort of shrug as our fundamental rights are casually brushed aside in the name of political expediency or a national emergency that actually wouldn't be one.
Another criticism
This
that is
test
leveled
could
is
apply
that
to anything, like just to
while
any
the protests
protest.
may have gotten, can we say, out of hand or snowballed and been extremely disruptive, they weren't the actions of a small minority, but a real expression of frustration, a legitimate frustration on behalf of a significant number of Canadians who had been through either suffered from or felt aggrieved by years of public health measures.
No worries, catch you on
And,
replay. It's all good.
In response to that, they wanted to engage and they wanted you to speak to them and they wanted to hear directly from their federal government, and that did not happen. So do you have an answer to that?
I think first of all, we heard them. We knew exactly what they were asking for. They were very, very clear that they wanted an end to mandates. The convoy protesters were expressing their disagreement with very specific public policies, that they were very vocal, both in mainstream communications and through social media on what they wanted, and they were very much heard. They had political parties in the previous election very much carrying those messages and presenting them to Canadians as part of the options that Canadians had to choose in that previous election. So people were well aware of the opinions, concerns, and perspective of those individuals. But it was clear that it wasn't that they just wanted to be heard. They wanted to be obeyed. They wanted us to change public policy, public health policy
That's
designed
what protest is
to
about.
help Canadians, and we're going to occupy locations across this country and interfere with the lives of Canadians until such a decision was taken.
Yeah, look at the Oka crisis.
Can't help but
the Mohawk got
have
to
noticed
prevent
that
their land from being,
when
paved. because
Premier
of that.
Kenney in Alberta did during the course of these
This is what protest is about.
convoy occupations, remove a number of mandates instead of decreasing the amount of concern. The convoy at Coots, the occupation at Coots, seemed to be emboldened, say, look, it's starting to work, let's keep going, instead of actually de-escalating. So
You negotiate
I am very aware
de-escalation.
that
the same way
expressing
you did with the
concern
train
and
protests.
disagreement around
Like you
positions
didn't
of
even
public
try the
policy
things
is,
that worked with
the
other
right,
protests.
and is to be encouraged by any Canadian who wants to. But the occupation and destabilization of and disruption of the lives of so many Canadians and refusal to maintain a lawful protest.
It's impossible to have a
is not
lawful
all right.
protest. It's just not possible. Because it's
One thing
impossible to
we haven't
stand on a
talked about
sidewalk
yet
without
is
breaking the law.
I
Uh,
assume you're familiar with the
protest
Section
breaks the law.
58 report to Parliament explaining the reasons for invoking the Emergencies Act. And if we look at that report, much of it focuses on the economic consequences of the protests and the economic disruptions and the threats to economic security. And you've spoken this morning about how the threshold for invoking the emergencies was met because there were threats of serious violence. But we haven't really addressed where economic security fits into this picture. So I'd like to hear you on that.
I think it's a piece of it, obviously. If people are facing losses of income, if we're seeing massive disruption in a country's economy, that will have and that could have real impacts on the stability and security of individuals within that country. But it was an additional concern on the situation. It wasn't the primary or the foundational one. Our job in here was to make sure we were keeping Canadians safe and countering the threats of serious violence that the occupations represented. And that's what we focused on.
Those hypothetical
The last
threats.
question I want to
Like
ask
when
you,
you
Prime
imagine
Minister,
a
is on the
threat, you
question
can imagine a
of
threat
trust
anywhere
in
you
public
want.
institutions.
My neighbor could come over
We know
here
you
and
said
murder
that
me right now.
part of your rationale
I need to go
for
take my neighbor out.
invoking the Emergencies Act and for
I don't
reacting
actually
to what you were
dislike
seeing
my
around you
neighbors.
was
I'm
you were
just
seeing
using
a
that as an
loss of
example.
confidence or loss of faith in Canada's public institutions, and that factored into your thinking. Against that is put that this action has destroyed a lot of people's faith in their public institutions because it was seen as an executive overreach. So what is your response to that? How do you see this having affected one way or the other?
I think we saw during the past couple of years and beyond that in the times we're living in,
This is
that
not good for my blood pressure.
people's
folks.
faith in their institutions and in their democracy is really, really important. During the pandemic, one of the things we knew that was really important was if we wanted people to follow public health advice, if we wanted them to stay safe during the pandemic and stay home during those first weeks of pan-Canadian lockdown, we needed to be delivering income supports for small businesses, support so people could hang on and know that
You also
they
needed
did the
to not
things
be
that kept
massive
themselves and their
hypocrites about
families
this.
safe, their
You know,
institutions were there to support them.
because
And
like
building up that confidence in institutions is really important.
you need to not
and
be massive
when
hypocrites where you're like
people
putting
across
on your
this
mask
country
for a photo opportunity
were
and then
noting,
taking it off right away
that
afterwards and caught
our
on video
police
doing that whole
can't
process.
even
Like, how is anyone supposed to take you seriously on this?
maintain order
crap?
in our capital
And
city.
I mean,
That we cannot maintain the flow of essential goods and services over our most important border crossing. That armed protesters at
that's
Coots
coming out later today.
in Alberta were able to defy
Look
the
up the
police
U.S. civil
for
rights
so
movement.
long.
Look up
people's
general strikes.
Faith in
Things we recognize as
our country's
protests are
institutions
often
able
way
to
more
do the basic
disruptive
things
than
around
what
keeping
happened in
them
Ottawa.
safe gets eroded. And that is something that one has to take very seriously, that I took very, very seriously.
I need like
Mr. Commissioner, those are
12.
my questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to now move into the cross-examinations. So I'd like to call on first the CCLA, please.
this. I want to see. Come on, CCLA, don't suck.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I'm Councillor for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Prime Minister,
your
I want
donations.
to start off with the quick chronology leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. On February 13th, you meet with the IRG around 4 p.m., correct?
Yes.
And then you meet with Cabinet the evening of the 13th, correct?
Yes.
And at that time,
I like that she's
cabinet delegates to you
cross-examining.
the ultimate decision to invoke the Emergencies Act, and Clerk Charette characterized this as left it ad referendum to the Prime Minister, correct?
Yes.
And you consult with your caucus the morning of the 14th, correct?
Yes.
And then with the First Ministers the morning of...
Sorry, it was more of an informing caucus than consulting with them, but yes.
Okay, that's fine. And then you consult with the First Ministers also the morning of the 14th. You speak to Mr. Jagmeet Singh and the Leader of the Opposition, Ms. Bergen, that same day. And you announce the invocation of the EA at a 4:30 press conference that afternoon, correct?
Yes.
Correct. And so the Emergencies Act is invoked on February 14th, and then the measures that are put in place under the Emergencies Act are enacted on February 15th, correct?
Yes.
And those, if I can put them as two buckets, the two buckets of measures that are invoked on the 15th, the first are there is now a prohibition on public assembly that may lead to a breach of the peace, correct?
Hmm.
And the second are various economic measures that include the freezing of accounts of anyone who is involved in that public assembly that may lead to a breach of the peace, correct?
Yes.
Right. And now going back a little bit, you spoke briefly about Windsor. The blockade at the Ambassador Bridge, that was a significant event. That was one of the events that led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, correct?
It was one of many, but yes.
It was one of many. And you understand that the police, both the Windsor Police Service and the OPP, started to clear that block starting on February 12th.
Yes.
And that continued on February 13th.
Yes.
And I believe WPS, Windsor Police Service, tweeted that the Windsor Ambassador Bridge was cleared at 1200 on February 14th.
She's very well
That
prepared.
sounds right.
I like that.
Now, with respect to Coots, that was another blockade of a border that was causing you and the government a significant concern, correct?
Yes.
And you were informed by Premier Kenny on February 14th in the morning that the RCMP had started to make arrests the night before, correct?
Yes.
And that, in his words, the situation has been secured and they will now proceed with broader arrests and secure the border. You remember that?
Yes.
And in Alberta is one of the provinces that had in place or has in place a critical infrastructure legislation that protects critical infrastructure from blockades, including highways, correct?
Yes.
Now, the Ottawa demonstrations and the blockade, they don't get removed until later in the week of February 15th, correct?
Correct.
And for the purpose of that operation, the RCMP, the OPP, and the OPS, they form a joint command.
Yes.
And Prime Minister, you agree that the Emergencies Act and the orders enacted under the Emergencies Act, there was nothing in those orders that created the joint command.
No.
Right?
Sorry. Yes, I agree that the Emergencies Act did not address creation of joint commands, although it did allow for the easy deputization of RCMP officers to enforce municipal bylaws and municipal rules without having to go through the usual processes that are required if they want to do that, which allowed for a greater integration.
Correct. It did away with the administrative process that was taking some time of having the RCMP enforce local bylaws.
So it did facilitate the coming together of those three forces.
But the joint command in and of itself, that was something that the police could have created and could have done without the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Yes.
Right. And we heard evidence from Commissioner Lucky of the RCMP that she had signed off on a plan to enforce and remove the protesters in Ottawa on February 13th, that she had confidence in, that she, the OPP, and the OPS had confidence in.
Are they about to throw Lucky under the bus?
No, I disagree with that.
Okay, you disagree with that?
Yes, I do not believe that the plan that was either signed off on supposedly by the RCMP or presented by the Ottawa Police Services on the 13th was in any real regards an actual plan for clearing the protests.
And is this a plan that you saw or that you were just spoken to about?
I was spoken to about. I did not see it myself.
Okay, and were you spoken to about it by Commissioner Lucky or by Minister Mendocino?
I don't remember.
You don't remember, but as at February 13th, your impression was that the plan that was in place at that time was not one that you or the RCMP had confidence in.
It was not one that we had confidence in, no.
Okay. All right. I will leave it there because I think there are other parties here that
because they gave her like
than I do. Okay.
8 minutes of time.
In terms of the legal tools that were available in Ottawa, we heard evidence from Superintendent Bernier, who was the event commander for the Ottawa Police Services. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. He testified that he did not communicate to anyone that he needed or the OPS needed additional tools in order to implement their plan. Did you hear that evidence?
In hindsight, yes. During this process. But at the time, you did not hear from OPS or Superintendent Bernier that the OPS required additional legal tools or legal resources. What we saw consistently was the occupation was continuing and the ability of the police to resolve it was not there.
Right, and you spoke about that earlier with Ms. Chowdhury, that both you, the government, and I think both Clerk Charette and Deputy Clerk Drouin all expressed the view that the view or even frustration that the police had not been using the legal tools available to them to remove the demonstrators.
Or had not been able to use.
Those tools.
Yes.
Okay, and Prime Minister Brenda Lucky, the commissioner of the RCMP, also on the 13th she was of the view that existing legal tools had not been exhausted, and she communicated this to the Chief of Staff of to Minister Mendocino. Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that at the time. As we went around the virtual table at the IRG that day, the consensus from everyone, including the Commissioner of the RCMP, was clear that we were advancing on these extra tools. And as I said, I don't disagree with that assessment.
Stumbling badly at
Not
this point.
all tools had been used. That was part of the problem, that not all tools were being used to end this occupation.
Right. And Prime Minister, we talked about the threshold for invoking a national emergency. You spoke about that briefly in your examination in chief. And you understand that other than the threshold in the CCLA Act, part of the test is whether the matter exceeds both the capacity and the authority of a province to deal with the matter. You understand that?
Yes.
And Deputy Clerk Drouin said that authority refers to legal authority and capacity refers to operational capacity. And you would agree with that?
Okay, yes.
And when I'm taking you back now to your press conference at 4:30 on the 14th. At that press conference, you specifically referred to the fact that there were serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law. You remember that?
Yes.
And that the Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels of the country. You remember saying that?
Yes.
And that the police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities.
Yes.
And so at that time,
This is
that
all
was
for show. There's not going to be any
one
real
of the main
consequences.
justifications that you stated publicly for the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Yes.
She's doing a
And
good
that
job.
was, again, because many of your ministers and many
This is
of
a
the
good
people in the
cross.
public service had expressed frustration with the police inability to exercise those legal tools.
No, it wasn't just because people had expressed frustration. It was real concern. As you mentioned, that a number of places were moving in the right direction in terms of resolving the situation at Coots, resolving the situation at the Ambassador Bridge. There was a very real and present concern that it is one thing to clear a lane or two. It is another thing to keep a border location or otherwise open. And what we had seen was intentions for the convoy to pop up again at the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia. At Fort Erie, there was discussion of Runkle. There were more activities starting in Surrey and BC at other border crossings. There was a ongoing concern that it wasn't just about ending the places that were there. It was ensuring that they simply didn't shift to another locale, because many of these convoy participants had come a long way across the country and were mobile enough to go to another nearby.
So what's
so
the
you were-
concern?
you were-
If they
you were in
move
a
out of
sense
the
making
areas
sure
that are affected
it was
and
almost
say have a
preventative
protest
in
outside of
terms
Ottawa,
we remove them and we want to
what's the
prevent
concern?
them from
Oh, it's their
relocating and
speech.
restaging at another location. Would that be fair?
Yes,
wanna-
that was a concern, but at the same time, there was very much a concern that it be temporary that we brought in, that we not keep the Emergencies Act in place for a minute longer than necessary. And when the RCMP suggested that they wanted it in place for 3 weeks, or they would need it in place for up to 3 weeks, we took that very seriously as a request, but we ended up saying, no, we're going to end it as quickly as we can, and we did.
And Prime Minister, you
Specifically,
spoke
they
about
ended
how
it
you were
to
advised
avoid,
that it would be impermissible
certain
for the government
requirements
to
to,
direct the police. And that was a line that you and your
confirm or
staff
to
and
show
your
that it
ministers
was
understood
required.
very clearly, correct?
Yes, we were very careful about that.
You're very
Aware
careful
of
about that.
yes.
But you'd agree that when you invoke the Emergencies Act and you very publicly say to the police, these are tools that you now have, that you are publicly signaling, this is the road we want you to walk down now and use these tools in order to deal with these demonstrators. Do you agree with that?
We were very clearly saying that we need to restore enforcement of the law and we need to restore public order. But as I said clearly a little earlier, in the situation of a theoretical blockade at Lacal, I was very clear with the Premier of Quebec and indeed in communications that if the public order emergency tools weren't necessary, they didn't need to use them.
And Quebec did not invoke their own Emergencies Act, correct? They did not.
I'm not sure, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, I don't think Quebec invoked their Emergencies Act for the purpose of the thing, for the convoy. Now, my last area of question, Prime Minister, is with respect to the CCS Act and its integration into the Emergencies Act. So you've stated under the CCS Act, when CCS determines that they are going to use surveillance on a person, they need to meet the threshold at Section 2, correct?
Yes.
And that's because the surveillance of one person without other legal authority is something that is very serious and that requires a high legal threshold, correct? Now, I understand your evidence that for the purpose of the Emergencies Act, we are dealing with a different context, yes?
Yes.
A different purpose?
Yes.
And we're dealing with a different decision maker, correct? But I would put to you that when invoking the Emergencies Act, that threshold, the level of threshold of the security threat that must be met cannot be any lower than it is when CCS is proposing to surveil one person, that the threshold is no different. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Those are my questions.
That was a good question. I like that question.
Okay, next is the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
Commissioner, my friend has asked to switch spots.
I see that.
We've advised the parties. Yes, I am not Mr. Kittredge. And no parties have objected. So.
Okay, well, in the spirit of cooperation, that's fine with me.
Thank you, sir.
And have you given up your time
No,
on
we
the
can't.
Canadian Constitution?
Oh no, not at all.
Okay, just want to be clear.
I know hope springs eternal, but I'm afraid not.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. I'd like to quickly circle back. Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning,
Particularly
Mr. Prime Minister.
given my mistake.
I'm Rob Kittredge for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and we share standing at these hearings with the Democracy Fund and Citizens for Freedom.
I need to watch
I'd
more
like
Supernatural
to
to
circle
find that
back
out.
to
Thank you, Betty and Josh
bit of a
Thompson. Much
constitutional
appreciated.
conversation I had the other day. Cabinet confidentiality, the
I'm pretty
principle
sure
that
she
members
ran out
of
of
cabinet
time.
are free to express their opinions
was
on issues
limited
before
and she
cabinet
kept
fully
it
in
to,
private meetings and discussions
a
with
very
you and their
precise
cabinet
time there.
colleagues. Are you familiar with that principle?
Yes, they are.
And the principle of cabinet solidarity, where once decisions are presented to the public or to Parliament, they are collective decisions of cabinet and can't be repudiated or criticized by your ministers. And if they were to do that, they would have to resign their post.
That is a principle, yes.
All right. Tow trucks have come up a lot at this commission, and my friends and the commissioner know me by now as a bit of a towing aficionado. It's been a while since I brought up the subject, but I thought maybe you and I could have a little talk about it. As you know, in order to legitimately and legally declare a public order emergency pursuant to the Emergencies Act, the purported emergency cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. You're taking the position that the emergency declaration was justified in part because towing services were required and could not be procured. Is that accurate?
That's a bit of a leap. We say that the Emergencies Act was required because the situation as a whole
was
could
a
not be
very
resolved
crisscross in terms
under
of
existing
keeping him
authorities
boxed
and
in.
was not being resolved under existing authorities.
I may do an
towing
entire video
service
just
procurement
on
was part of that
later.
total picture that you're talking about,
And
wasn't it?
how it
One
relates
of the
to cross-examination
barriers that we
strategy.
heard regularly from police of jurisdiction to removing the trucks
I like his
occupying various
expression.
locations was the difficulty in securing towing services. Yes, that was one of the barriers they were facing in being able to restore public order.
Right. So one of the measures that you put in place through the emergency measures regulations was an ability to compel tow truck drivers to provide towing services, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
So I'd say that would be a fairly significant part of the reason why you would have had to invoke the Emergencies Act. Wouldn't you agree with that?
It was an element of the solutions to the situation that that we were dealing with. Yes.
It was one of a handful of powers that you created using the emergency measures regulations. Is that right?
Yes.
So I would say it's relatively important. Would you agree with that?
It was important in yes, solving the emergency situation. Yes.
Certainly relevant to the invocation of the Emergencies Act?
The invocation of the Emergencies Act wasn't because people couldn't find tow trucks. The invocation was because there was a public order emergency that posed serious threats to Canadians, and the inability to solve this public order emergency that posed a serious threat to the safety of Canadians was compounded by the inability to actually move those trucks, for example.
And that would be one of the ways that the emergency couldn't have been
Might be a good video. I'll
effectively
have
dealt
to,
with under any law,
talk
any
about
other
it
law
later.
of Canada, wouldn't you say?
Municipalities and provinces have contracts with tow truck companies to keep the highways clear, to keep the roads clear, and tow parked cars that are illegally parked all the time. So they had theoretically the authority to compel people under breach of contract to actually tow vehicles that were illegally parked. For various reasons, they were unable or unwilling to use the civil powers they have under contract, or perhaps it would just take too long for them to be able to do it. But in feedback with everyone from Alberta to Ontario to elsewhere, was that they needed to be able to compel those tow trucks to actually do the job of clearing those streets.
And you in fact
Compelled
put
labor.
that power into the emergency measures regulations.
Yes, we did.
And
Is
so a
terrible.
discussion of,
And
of tow trucks is relevant to this discussion we're having right now.
Yes.
like compelled
And
labor.
we talked about cabinet solidarity earlier. There's been a waiver of cabinet confidence, the
I
related
could do a whole
the
video
partial
on,
waiver, I should
on
say,
this
of
in
cabinet
terms of contract law
confidence,
and
the
so
related
forth.
principle that would have allowed you to withhold documents from this commission. You've disclosed quite a few, and would you say you've been pretty transparent with the commission?
There have been hundreds of public inquiries over the course of our country's history, and only 4 times were there waivers of cabinet confidence. For this situation, it was extremely important to me that all the inputs, or as many inputs as possible, that cabinet received in making the determinations that we did, are visible to Canadians. So yes, we waived cabinet confidence in terms of the inputs that cabinet heard to make the decision, but the actual deliberations, as you point out, remain secret.
Great. So you wanted to make sure that the relevant matters were visible to Canadians. Can I pull up POE JCF 2, please? So this is a
Folks in the
document
chat,
as it's coming up.
if you
We've been
start
having a bit of an
talking
argument
about
over the last
violence,
little while about some redactions that were made
or
in
bad
the
things
documents
happening to
disclosed
politicians,
by my
you are
friends from
going to get
Canada.
removed. 'Cause,
And there were some disputes
can't-
about
YouTube
parliamentary
will get very
privilege
upset
and,
if that's
and
in there.
irrelevance.
So you
But
can't
in
do
this
that here.
particular document, I'd like you to take a look at this. This first document was what was originally disclosed. And this document, the second one, had some redactions removed and those documents were ordered disclosed last night, and Canada took the position last night that there was reason to insist on this redaction, or that this document not be produced unredacted. But I wonder if maybe you could, and at the end of the day, this was produced at 10:26 a.m. this morning, so I'm a little more unprepared for this cross than I normally am.
Of course he was. They've disclosed
I wonder
it
if you could
at,
look at that first
way in the morning.
redaction on the
Which is
original
so
disclosure and see if you can
obnoxious.
see the reason for the redaction that's highlighted in the black box there.
YouTube's rules, they'll kill my
appears to say
channel.
Parliament,
So
irrelevant and parliamentary
I gotta
privilege.
Right.
follow
So
that
I'm
one.
looking at the irrelevant one. Could you identify on the other side what information was blacked out as irrelevant by your government?
Americans offering tow trucks.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say that discussion of tow trucks was relevant to the discussion we're having here today?
Nice.
I'm
I
not
like
the one
that.
who made these redactions. It's the professional public service that made those redactions. So you'd have to ask them.
Right. Well, I think we will be. But in any event, I would put it to you that tow trucks weren't in fact required.
You have no
that
idea how
The
tired
power
I
to
am
compel
right
tow
now.
trucks
I'm
was
super
not used
tired.
for anything other than convenience. And that tow trucks had been secured at all important locations prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I got to say, it's interesting to close on this tow truck point. I hadn't expected that to happen. But would you agree with me that tow trucks weren't in fact needed at the time of the invocation of the Act?
Mr. Commissioner,
I do not.
Brian Gover for the Government of Canada. And if my friend is going to put that to the witness, he ought to put the proposition correctly. I remind my friend that the evidence of Commissioner Carrique of the Ontario Provincial Police was that the powers under the Emergency Measures Regulation in relation to tow trucks were used. I refer specifically to his February 22nd, 2022 report to Deputy Solicitor General Di Tommaso, which shows that clearly those powers were used. Thank you.
Right. Well, I would respond by saying that the evidence so far has shown that while
I hope everything's
while
okay,
strictly
Aaron.
speaking, there was an invocation of, or there was a use of that power under the Act by the OPP. It was basically used as a method to ensure that the payment was made.
It's
People
supposed
are
to
making
come to
comments
me,
that
and
would
I
be
think
on that.
those
So
happen to
that's
be
where
areas
the
that
issue
I'm going to
comes
have
up.
to deal with,
Fair enough.
what is in fact the case, but you can pose your question in a different way if you wish, but I think whether or not they were used, whether or not it was required is something I will.
I think
rule on.
I think we're burying the lead a little bit here, and I'll ask you again. You would agree that a discussion of tow trucks and information about tow trucks is relevant to the work of the commission and the discussion that we're having here today, wouldn't you?
I know there was a lot of time spent on tow trucks during the past 6 weeks.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next is now the Canadian Constitution Foundation, or have I? It is? Okay, thank you. I don't want to get it wrong again.
Yeah, he's real
It's
smug.
been a long 6 weeks, Commissioner. Good morning, Prime Minister. My name is Sujit Chaudhary. I'm counsel for the CCF.
Yeah, that
Prime Minister,
objection
I'd
was a
like
good
to,
objection.
shift gears
I
a
mean,
bit
as much as I don't like
and
it, it
ask
bought him
you
some
some
breathing
questions
space.
about your role as
and-
chair of the cabinet.
Yeah.
And so it's true, would you agree, that one of your chief responsibilities as Prime Minister is to chair the cabinet?
Yes.
And it's a serious responsibility.
Yes.
And so yesterday, there was a panel testifying from the Prime Minister's office, I'm sure you're aware. And your Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, answered questions about your role as chair of the cabinet. Are you aware of her testimony?
Yes.
And so she, under cross-examination, she testified that you are the ultimate decision maker for determining the information and documentation shared at cabinet meetings. Do you have any reason to disagree with what she said?
Yeah, that was in a series of questions, linked to, who ultimately decides who's in the room or not. The reality is the authority rests with me. If I, in seeing what the public service has prepared for
we've got
me
a constitution,
as a
but
list
maybe
of
this would
subjects at
require a
cabinet or
discussion about what a
attendees at
constitution
cabinet
means.
or documents
So
to be provided at
We'll
cabinet.
move on.
If I have significant issue with any one of them, I can say, no, we're not going to present that to cabinet and it won't go to cabinet.
What we
But
don't have is a
as
good charter.
par for the course, I do not spend time going over in advance every possible document going to cabinet to say, yes, this can go, this shouldn't go, this can't go. It's in exceptional circumstances.
So there's advice provided to you by the Privy Council office? Is that what you're saying on what documentation and information goes to cabinet? It's presented to you for review and then you sign off on it, yes or no?
No, for example, if we're dealing in cabinet with a particular MC from, or a particular proposal from a given department, they will put forward that document, that proposal. I will, as par for the course as all cabinet members do, read through that documentation as part of our deliberations that we're about to have. But for me, I have the power to say, no, you know what, we're not going to discuss this today, or this document's not going to go in, which I do from time to time. If we decide, no, it's not ready to go forward, we're not going to do that. But I guess I'm not entirely sure what power you're trying to get me to admit to having or not having.
Sure. So well, why don't we talk about the February 13th cabinet meeting?
I don't mind that.
So the questions are about that. And so you'd agree, sir, that
was a good
was
remark or a
an
good bit of
extraordinarily
snark back
important cabinet meeting,
Yes.
a historic meeting even?
Yes.
And even though it was happening at a time of great pressure, of great urgency.
They're not going to charge him.
You would have
It's
taken
just
care
not
to
gonna
determine
happen.
in your capacity as chair of cabinet that cabinet had all the relevant information and documentation before it.
The way cabinet works is we do an awful lot of work in cabinet committees. We do not, as a par for a course, dig into every item that comes forward in a fulsome way because we have subgroups of cabinet that dig into that. So there will have been, before any cabinet meeting, including that one, subgroupings meeting to debate, to discuss things that then get reported back to cabinet.
But you would agree that under the Emergencies Act, as you stated this morning in testimony, the power to declare a public order emergency rests with what you called the cabinet and prime minister, which is the governor
and council,
right? Which is the full cabinet, not a cabinet subcommittee.
No, that's right.
Okay.
Cabinet subcommittees deliberate, but as a matter of generality, they don't make final determinations.
And you agree, there's no way you could have declared a public order emergency without having a full cabinet meeting.
He doesn't like this question.
In this case, it was something very important to me. I could imagine catastrophic scenarios in which a government might have to declare a public order emergency without a meeting of full cabinet, either because of urgency or because of circumstance that prevents cabinet from gathering.
So, but in this case, there was such a meeting.
Yes, in this case, I chose to have a meeting.
So I'd like to ask you some questions of what you've termed as the inputs to that meeting. And just to be abundantly clear to my friend from the Attorney General of Canada, I'm not going to ask you about the content of any of those inputs that might be protected by confidence. I just simply want to ask you if certain documents were inputs or not to the cabinet meeting, if I may. So the first is that we've heard in testimony that there was a legal opinion that explained the difference in the definition of threats to the security of Canada in the CCLA Act and the Emergencies Act. And you've testified to that this morning. Do you know, sir, if that a legal opinion was provided to the full cabinet at its meeting of February 13th?
In matters of legal opinion, in many situations, most situations, we hear from the Attorney General and Justice Minister who reports to cabinet on this or that legal opinion.
So was that written opinion provided to the cabinet, sir?
I believe it was a report from, a verbal report from the Minister of Justice.
I'd like to ask you about another document, which is that we've heard about a threat assessment prepared by CSIS, and you're familiar with that as well. And Director Vigneault testified that he'd concluded, or CSIS had concluded, that there wasn't a threat to national security under 2C of the CSIS Act. He also testified that that threat assessment was provided to the IRG on February 13th. So my question is, was this threat assessment provided to the full cabinet on the evening of February 13th?
In our reporting to cabinet, there was a reporting on the consensus
reporting, there was
reached
a
by the
reporting,
IRG,
okay.
including the director of CSIS, who recommended and agreed with the invocation of a public order emergency.
It is, isn't it?
We were not at cabinet dealing with whether or not CSIS had the authority to move forward with a wiretap on one person or another. It was a discussion on the invocation of a public order emergency, which requires reasonable grounds for the governor and council to make a determination.
So, sir, you'd agree that that document was not provided to the full cabinet on February 13th? You said a report.
Which document is that?
The CSIS threat assessment. And if I could rephrase what you said, you just said the IRG considered that report, it discussed it.
No. Throughout the IRGs, CSIS, as a par for a course, would mention that the threshold had not been met for CSIS operations within this of a particular type, according to their context and their mandate. But we were not
But it's the
looking
same
as
language,
an
exactly.
IRG or a cabinet as to whether or not CSIS would be allowed to do this or that thing. We were looking at, certainly
It's the
by
same
this end,
test. If CSIS can't,
whether or
you
not
can't.
we had a
Same
threshold
test.
met for the invocation of a public order emergency.
So Prime Minister, Director Vigneault testified that a written threat assessment was prepared by CSIS, and he testified that he provided that to the IRG.
Yes.
Are you saying that that document was not provided to the IRG?
No, that would have been provided to the IRG.
But would you agree that it wasn't provided to the full cabinet?
Yes, I agree that it was that
So they hid
the
it from
report
cabinet.
was given, that that the narrow CSIS threshold was not met for a CSIS operation, but because that was not the issue at play in this cabinet discussion, the issue was the threat of serious violence threshold met in the context of a public order emergency, was the discussion at play.
And Prime Minister, this morning in your testimony, you addressed the policing plan that was prepared by the OPS, and I believe you stated we should read it, we should look at it, because it wasn't much of a plan. Is that fair?
That is my understanding of it.
So, sir, I'd like to pull the plan up on the screen, please.
God, no, I have to
and
spend
Mr.
all my
Registrar,
days dealing with politicians.
NSC CAN 407734.
He's going to dodge questions as much as he can. This isn't sarcastic. This is actually the proper behavior. In court, the Crown and I, we can be having
Thank you, Mr.
a real
Registrar.
head
Prime
to
Minister,
head.
is this the
and I still
document or
refer
is this
to
the
my
plan
friend.
you were referring to?
That's how you refer to the
I have
opposing
not.
counsel.
I have heard about this. I haven't ever actually seen it. So
So, what I'd like to do, so you've not read this.
no, I have not.
I
Okay,
like
so
the
I'd like-
certainly had not read it
CCLA's
on the
cross.
13th.
Okay. And so
good.
I'd like to just, Mr. Registrar, I'd just like to walk the Prime Minister through the
He's got to say
pages,
something.
not so he could read
Preserve.
it because we don't have time, but just to point out that this is a heavily redacted document. So page 1 is the cover page. Page 2 is this signature page. If we could go down, page 3 is a description of the situation and the mission.
Mhm.
And then Mr. Registrar, if you could please scroll down. The rest of this document has been redacted. So that's page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8. So Prime Minister, you said we should read this plan. We can't. It's within your legal authority
see his
to
smug smile
instruct
there?
your counsel to remove these redactions. For the sake of the transparency of this commission, sir, would you consider that request?
I object to that. On behalf of the Government of Canada, it's Brian Gover once again. This is putting the Prime Minister in an odious position.
That's not
we
an
had
objection.
no notice that they would attempt this in cross-examination. These things require
Why would you
careful
give notice in
consideration,
cross-examination?
do not lend themselves to decisions in the moment, and we maintain
That's what
our objection.
cross-examination is about.
Commissioner, sorry, sir.
He only asked him to consider.
This was in our document list
Like-
that we circulated within time. to counsel for the Attorney General. They had noticed that we would be putting this document. And the question is a fair one in response to the Prime Minister's testimony this morning that he said you should read it.
I think it is fair in a sense, but I think what's being raised is it's a little more complicated than the federal government or the Prime Minister releasing these. This is a police operational plan of the OPS involving officers from the OPS and from OPP involving strategy, et cetera. And I would be very surprised if the federal government would order its release without consulting with the various police services. And I think that's the unfairness that's being referred to. And quite frankly, I agree. Now, having said that, he made reference to the plan, and there is an issue about reading it for sure, but I think the context is important here.
So Commissioner, with that, with your ruling there, and I thank Mr. Glover for his point, Prime Minister, can I put it to you this way? You said we should read the plan, but I think you would agree we can't.
Indeed.
That's a fair point.
As I said, I haven't read the plan, but we're in a situation where, as can be imagined, I have access to unredacted information. And what I know and my understanding of this plan was, and I'm happy to testify to that, that it was not a complete plan of engagement.
And Prime Minister, and again, I think I would like to raise this again. I'm looking to Mr. Glover in anticipation of his reaction. As you know, there's a legal opinion.
Why would you do that?
That over which solicitor-client privilege has been asserted. We asked Minister Lametti
flag that there's going to be an
to release that opinion, and in a public statement this week, he said he couldn't because he lacked the authority to. That would be up to his client, and he then clarified that his client is the governor and council. So again, for the record, sir, and this has been an issue for all week, not just this morning.
0%
would you
chance.
Advise that opinion be released in the interest of transparency?
Mr. Commissioner, it's Brian Gover once again for the Government of Canada. Solicitor-client privilege, of course, is a very substantial right in our legal system. It's one that the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized as a constitutional dimension. I remind my friends that in this case, as the Prime Minister has said, cabinet confidence has been waived for the fourth time in 155 years to provide evidence of inputs. We know that the decision note that was referred to in testimony by the Clerk of the Privy Council referred to the advice of the public service that it was appropriate to invoke the Emergencies Act. In my submission, we need not go further with the inquiry and pierce the veil of solicitor-client privilege, setting what in my submission could be a dangerous precedent going forward. And this is certainly an issue that requires careful
Didn't you say that there
consideration
wasn't
and
going
not
to
one
be
to
opening
require
the
a Prime
door?
Minister to respond to in the spur of the moment.
How are
Thank
we
you.
setting a dangerous precedent if we're not going to be invoking the Emergencies Act all the time?
I think you have a refusal essentially by council, so I think you're going to have to move on.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. And so I have one final question, sir. So there has been a lot of discussion this week about legal thresholds and how they differ under the Emergencies Act on your government submission than they do under the CCS Act. And you testified about this morning. I just want to ask you one question. The emergency was revoked on February 23rd, correct?
Yes.
We can take my word for it. And prior to that revocation, there was a great deal of public debate and public discussion about the case for the emergency made by the government. Is that right?
Yes.
And sir, I put it to you that not until this commission has the government of Canada ever publicly communicated that the threshold for determining a threat to national security is different under the Emergencies Act than under the CCS Act. Not once. Why is that, sir?
It's in the first line of the public order emergency section of the Emergencies Act that the governor and council can, on reasonable grounds, declare a public order emergency if.
But that doesn't say that there's a different stat.
reasonable opinion, I'm paraphrasing obviously, there are threats to the security of Canada, and it is a national emergency. That doesn't mention
Yeah, the NDP
CSIS
sent me a
threshold
thing
anywhere.
begging for money. I had some comments.
Commissioner, I think those conclude my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before I go
He
to the
wasn't
next
nearly as good as the
cross-examiner, there
CCLA,
seems to be
counsel.
some reactions in the crowd that, in my view, are inappropriate. This is I think, a very important process and very serious. There
Crowd
are a
was
lot
yelling,
of people outside,
"Yes."
as I understand it, who would like to come in. I would ask you to please refrain from comments or laughing or whatever, and try and keep it serious. That would be appreciated. And not only appreciated, if necessary, it will be enforced. So could I
The
ask that
crowd is not
you continue
not
to
happy
be
with him, with Trudeau. I'm
attentive
guessing.
and pay the attention that is required for what's going on. So with that brief comment, call on the Ottawa Police Service, please.
It basically says if you're laughing, we can find another person to take the seat here. So far, they've all been
Good afternoon,
hypothetical
Prime
threats.
Minister. My name is Jessica Barrell, and I am counsel for the Ottawa Police Service. Prime Minister, we've heard evidence from you about your understanding of intelligence information as well as operational planning at various points throughout the events in Ottawa. And I just want to clarify your role as it relates to that information.
This is why it's better to
And
be
I
on
take
live
it
stream.
It's not your role as Prime
'cause
Minister
I can
to
laugh.
collect intelligence information. Is that correct?
No, it's not.
Similarly, it's not your role to review the details of an operational plan.
No, it's certainly not.
And that's because you rely on highly trained police officers to perform the work that they're best at, which is performing those functions.
She's
and
here
then it
because
gets
he's
briefed up
throwing
to
the
you. Is that
OPP under
fair?
the bus, and they're going.
And I assume that you regularly
Eat me.
rely in particular on the intelligence and operational planning expertise of the RCMP as they are the National Police Service, correct?
Yes,
And of course, you trust them to perform those functions effectively.
yes.
Okay. So we've heard considerable evidence to date from the commission that an integrated planning cell arrived in Ottawa on February 8th. Were you aware of that?
That sounds right.
And we also heard that Superintendent Bernier from Ottawa Police Service took over as event commander on February 10th and established what he referred to as an integrated command structure, which we heard described from him as including experts from subject matter areas such as negotiations, public order, intelligence, etc.
Negotiations.
Were you aware of that?
Why would you need that?
Sounds reasonable.
We don't do
Okay.
that here.
And the experts involved in both the integrated planning cell and the ultimate integrated command structure included senior and specially trained officers from OPS, RCMP, OPP, and other municipal police
She's got
services. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I was aware of
Cop
that.
voice.
And as you indicated, you would have, of course, leave it up to those experts to draft, review, and approve operational plans. Is that fair?
Yes,
Okay. And you certainly wouldn't have had the capacity in your role to engage in any kind of line-by-line review or assessment of the viability of those operational plans.
no.
Okay. And so I want to focus, because we've heard a fair bit of evidence about this morning, in relation to the timeframe of February 12th onwards and the operational plans that existed at that time. You participated in an IRG meeting on February 12th, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so I'd like to pull up the minutes from that meeting if we can. It's SSM NSC CAN 214, please.
I don't mean like the crackling. I mean her demeanor in that.
And in particular,
I'm wondering if
I'm
she's a
looking
former
for
police
page
officer.
6, Mr. Clerk. And so we see in the second paragraph that this is a update from the Minister of Public Safety.
Yeah, some of
And we
that
see
too.
the last sentence of that. During the discussion, confirmation was obtained that the OPS Chief of Police accepted the plan and the Commissioner of the RCMP agreed to be able to provide additional details of that plan at the next call. Do you recall that?
I'm looking at the sentence before where it says there appears to be a lack of a plan in Ottawa, with the Chief of Ottawa Police Services having yet to approve the plan developed with the RCMP and OPP.
Right, and then subsequent to that, we see that in the middle of the meeting, there's confirmation that the OPS chief has agreed to the plan and that Commissioner Lucky agrees to provide additional details to this group subsequently in relation to the details. Is that fair?
Fair.
Okay. And so this was put to Commissioner Lucky in her testimony. And my understanding of her evidence is that she never did subsequently provide the details of that plan to this group on the 13th or otherwise. Would you disagree with that evidence?
No, I agree, because what we heard was the plans were not adequate. They were not operational plans at that point.
Okay, but you didn't ever hear the details of the plan. And she certainly doesn't say in this meeting that from her perspective, it was not an adequate plan. She's just saying, I'll provide you an update later.
I can't speak to what she
That's not a good
was
question. That's a
knowing or
complicated
not,
what the hell
but I can
question.
say that when we were briefed on the 13th as to the operational plan or readiness of enforcement in Ottawa, we were understanding that there was not a full operational plan at that point.
Okay, so your understanding of what occurred on the 13th was that you were provided some level of information that led you to believe that there was no complete operational plan. Is that fair?
That was consistent with everything we heard throughout the course of the 3 weeks, that there were not yet concrete plans to be able to actually do the work that Canadians were hoping to see.
Right. So I understand that there are various planning timeframes, but I'm
Back in a
specifically
second,
talking
Oh crap! Did I shut the audio off?
I can't speak to
Sorry about that.
whether this is a good plan or a complete plan or not. I haven't read this, obviously.
Right, and so you hadn't read
shouldn't
it,
be
obviously,
paused.
No,
then.
I rely on the inputs of
Crud! Sorry about
the
that.
experts
I had to go
around me
deal with
to
dog stuff.
reassure
I
me
just
or
screwed that up.
not that there is a capacity to move forward.
Okay, so let's turn to page 8.
My dog was
And we
trying
see the
to escape.
objectives
My bad.
listed, if you could scroll down. And it says to facilitate a resolution through de-escalation, graduated, measurable, and multi-phased response while ensuring
Oh,
the safety of
I'm an idiot.
participants,
Well,
citizen, and
I'm
members of
tired.
participating agencies and return the city of Ottawa to a state of normality. And so you referenced earlier in relation to the plan that from your understanding, all it was to continue the negotiations essentially that were already taking place, correct?
Listen, I am hesitant to speak to fragments.
Sorry,
but
folks.
I don't know that objective 1
I had to step away for a second and I screwed things
looks
up.
like
Why is my
the
video
enforcement action that
screwed?
actually happened later that week.
Okay, well, I can
If they
tell you.
talk about a de-escalation,
Hopefully the video is going to keep running here.
graduated, measurable, and multi-phased response sounds like something that would take longer than the 24 to 48 hours that the enforcement action actually took on Friday and Saturday. But I'm no expert on this, so my lawyers are
enough.
probably glaring at me for opining on this too much.
Fair enough. Well, I can tell you that the experts on the plan have testified, and they have testified that this was the plan that they were acting on the weekend of February 18th when they completed the POU operation. Would you have any reason to disagree with that?
I think evaluating various testimonies is the job of the commissioner.
Fair enough. Okay. And I just want to pull up.
You're pretty close. Well, not pretty close. You're over the end. So if you can try and wrap it up, please.
Thank you. And so to circle back to the comments you provided in relation to the readiness of police plans as of the 13th, I take
I
it
don't
you
think
would
I have the
agree with me
ability
that
to
perhaps
put it
there
at
was a little bit
1.5.
more substance to the plans than you were aware of on the 13th.
I am unable to speak to that.
Okay. And we've heard evidence that the Ottawa police were required to acquire
I mean,
approximately
I'm not responsible
2,200
for chat
additional police
comments, but
officers
also I
from
haven't
across the
actually
country to
seen,
support this plan
you know,
and to successfully
anything that
complete the
isn't-
POU
I mean,
operation that
there's a lot of
occurred on the
political
weekend of
commentary,
February
but,
18th. Would you have any reason to disagree with that?
I don't really
wasn't,
support this legal
aware
advice
of-
here.
I wasn't following that presentation of evidence, so I can't comment on
Fair enough. And you may have heard
Yeah.
or not that this was the largest POU operation in Canadian history. Were you aware
that.
of
That I was aware of.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Those are my questions.
Okay, well, thank you. This is a little early, 2 minutes early. We don't normally give an hour and 2 minutes for lunch, but I think today we will as a special occasion.
Thank you for your generosity.
So we'll come back at 2 o'clock.
Oh, what a
The commission is in
storm.
recess until 2 o'clock. La commission est levée jusqu'à 14 heures.
Well, the joys of screwing up the stream. I could see the viewer count halved, but that's on me. Yeah. So they're going to take an hour and 2 minutes for lunch. I'm just debating whether we come back at that point or what we do because I am tired. I could probably use the hour to nap. She wasn't nearly as good as the CCLA's lawyer. Really what she was there for was basically to try to save face for the Ottawa police because Trudeau's throwing her all the way under the bus. And because of that, they're basically saying, we weren't, we didn't lack a plan here. We didn't lack we were gonna proceed. I'm debating, it wouldn't make sense for me to take a nap and leave this up here running. So, yeah, it's, what I'll probably do is set up another stream for, in an hour and come back to find you guys at that point. I will talk a little bit about the C21 thing because there's a lot of people. I'm going to put up a video properly discussing the C21 thing in a little bit. That'll be later today, but yeah, we'll have to see there. I see wait until the lawyer for the BC Chiefs. Her being cute is irrelevant, but does nothing but bring up UN drip. I mean, that's going to be her job there too. So, yeah, the amendments to Bill C-21 would basically ban every semi-automatic rifle in Canada, or virtually every, and they're trying to ban every other one that wasn't covered with specific named bans. So it's just ridiculous is what it comes down to, but yeah. I could rant for the full hour on that, but I should really, really sort of crash out for a little bit here. All right, so I'm gonna shut this down here. I'll set up another stream for an hour post lunch. Everybody can go grab some lunch and so forth. I'm gonna have to do a number of videos on this because the new stuff there's a lot to it. I just cover sort of discussion on the addition of the semi-auto ban, but yeah, and set your alarm clock. Yep. Yeah, it would not surprise me if they're looking to ban a whole lot more. All right. Yeah, I'll see you guys in an hour, and we'll go from there. Cheers.